The ballroom fell silent the moment Cedric Ashcombe entered, not because anyone respected him anymore, but because they were waiting to see how far a duke could fall before he shattered completely. He stood in the doorway like a ghost at his own funeral, shoulders squared beneath the weight of whispers that cut deeper than any blade Napoleon's army ever carried. Every eye in the room knew what he'd done. Every tongue had already tasted his name mixed with the word traitor. And somewhere in that crowd of silk and malice, his wife stood perfectly still, watching the masterpiece of his destruction unfold exactly as she'd designed it. This is how empires collapse. Not with armies or revolutions, but with one woman who learned that silence is just another word for permission. Stay with me, because what happens next will rewrite everything you thought you knew about revenge. The rain came down hard the night Evelyn found them. Not the letters. Not yet. First came the sounds. She'd been walking past Cedric's private study on the second floor of Ashcombe Manor when she heard his voice through the door, low and careful, the kind of tone a man uses when he's speaking to someone who isn't supposed to exist. Evelyn stopped mid-step, her silk shoes soundless against the Persian runner, and pressed her palm flat against the mahogany paneling. His voice again. Softer now. Almost tender. She didn't knock. Duchesses didn't knock on doors in their own homes. She turned the brass handle slowly and pushed. Cedric stood by the window with his back to her, one hand braced against the frame, the other holding a folded piece of paper that looked like it had been read 100 times. He didn't turn around when the door opened, didn't flinch, just kept staring out at the rain like it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. Evelyn stood in the doorway and waited. Finally, he spoke without turning. His voice carried that particular emptiness she'd learned to recognize over 7 years of marriage, the hollow sound of a man who'd stopped pretending to care whether his wife noticed he was lying. "I'll be in London tomorrow," he said. "Parliamentary session runs through the weekend." It was Tuesday. Parliament hadn't convened on weekends since the war ended. She could have called him on it, could have demanded to see the letter in his hand, could have screamed or wept or done any of the things wives were supposed to do when they suspected their husbands of betrayal. Instead, she nodded once, smoothed her skirts, and left the room as quietly as she'd entered. Because Evelyn Ashcombe had learned something crucial in 7 years of marriage to one of England's most powerful men. Confrontation gave your enemy time to prepare. Silence gave you time to plan. She waited 3 days. On the 4th night, when Cedric left for what he claimed was a late session at Parliament, Evelyn climbed the servants' staircase to his study with a candle in one hand and a letter opener in the other. The house staff had been dismissed for the evening. The hallways stretched dark and empty around her, broken only by portraits of Ashcombe ancestors who'd built their fortune on land and loyalty to the crown. She wondered what they'd think of their descendant now. The study door wasn't locked. Why would it be? Cedric had never imagined his wife would come looking for proof of something she already knew in her bones was true. Men like him never did. They built their lives on the assumption that wives existed to be ornamental and obedient, that marriage was a contract where love was optional, but discretion was mandatory. Evelyn set the candle on his desk and began searching. The drawers yielded nothing but financial records and political correspondence, the usual architecture of a duke's daily business. She moved methodically through the room, running her fingers along bookshelves, checking behind paintings, testing floorboards for the telltale give of a hiding place. She found it beneath the rug near the fireplace. 3 boards came up easily when she wedged the letter opener into the gap, revealing a shallow space lined with oilcloth. Inside lay a wooden box about the size of a prayer book, though Evelyn suspected whatever it contained had nothing to do with God. Her hands shook as she lifted it out. The letters inside weren't bundled with ribbon or string. They were simply stacked, dozens of them, the paper varying in quality and thickness like they'd been written over years from different locations under different circumstances. The top one was dated 6 months earlier. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, unmistakably French. Mon cher Cedric. The distance between us grows heavier each day, but your last letter reminded me why I endure it. When this war finally ends and the madness subsides, we will have what we were always meant to possess, a life built on truth rather than obligation, on passion rather than duty. Evelyn's vision blurred. She blinked hard and kept reading. The letter went on for 2 pages, filled with the kind of intimate language that belonged in bedrooms, not correspondence. but it was the final paragraph that made her blood turn cold. I received the funds you sent through the Rotterdam account. Your discretion continues to be impeccable, darling. With this latest transfer, I should have enough to secure passage once the naval blockades lift. Your information about the troop movements near Calais was invaluable. It allowed several families to evacuate before the bombardment. I know the risk you take in sharing such things, but your courage saves lives while your colleagues play at politics from their comfortable chambers. Evelyn set the letter down carefully, as if it might detonate. Then she opened another, and another. By the time she'd read through half the box, the candle had burned down 2 inches, and dawn was threatening the horizon beyond the study windows. Her legs had gone numb from kneeling on the floor. Her mind felt like it was splitting apart and reassembling into something harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous than the woman who'd climbed those stairs 4 hours earlier. The letters painted a portrait that would destroy Cedric Ashcombe if anyone else saw them. A years-long affair with a French woman named Celeste Moreau, who lived in Paris during the height of the war. Financial transfers that circumvented England's wartime restrictions. Casual mentions of military intelligence, troop positions, supply routes, names of officers and nobles who supported continued aggression against France. Information that could have gotten British soldiers killed if it fell into the wrong hands. Whether Cedric had intended to commit treason or simply couldn't separate pillow talk from patriotism didn't matter. In the current climate of post-war paranoia and anti-French hatred sweeping through London's elite circles, these letters were a loaded pistol aimed directly at his heart. And Evelyn was holding the trigger. She replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, fitted the floorboards back into place, smoothed the rug. By the time she descended to her own chambers, the household was beginning to stir. She could hear the cook moving around in the kitchen below, the stable boy leading horses out for their morning exercise. Evelyn lay down fully clothed on top of her bed and stared at the ceiling. 7 years ago, she'd married Cedric Ashcombe because that's what daughters of bankrupt viscounts did when dukes offered proposals. She'd been 19 and stupid enough to believe that duty might eventually transform into affection, that sharing a name and a bed would somehow alchemize into the kind of partnership her mother had whispered about before the fever took her. She'd been wrong. Cedric had wanted a duchess the way men wanted furniture, something decorative to fill a required space in his life, while he pursued whatever actually interested him elsewhere. He attended her in public with impeccable manners and ignored her in private with equal consistency. Their marriage had been 7 years of beautifully orchestrated loneliness, of learning to sleep alone in a house full of servants, of smiling through dinner parties while her husband's eyes glazed over whenever she spoke. She could have endured the loneliness. Women of her class were trained from birth to endure. But the letters changed everything, because they proved Cedric wasn't just indifferent to her. He was capable of passion, of devotion, of the kind of obsessive attention that poets wrote about and fools died for. He'd simply chosen to give all of it to someone else, while expecting Evelyn to remain grateful for the scraps of his name and fortune. The humiliation of that realization burned hotter than any jealousy. She rose from the bed as the sun broke fully over the estate grounds, walked to her writing desk, and began composing the first letter that would set London on fire. 3 weeks later, Evelyn stood in Lady Pemberton's drawing room wearing a dress the color of mourning and a smile sharp enough to draw blood. The gathering was small by aristocratic standards. Only 20 women, the wives and daughters of England's most influential families, assembled for what was nominally an afternoon tea, but functioned as the social equivalent of a war council. These were the women who decided which families rose and which fell, who whispered reputations into existence or oblivion depending on which direction their favor turned. Lady Pemberton herself was holding court near the fireplace, a silver-haired viper in silk who'd buried 3 husbands and outlasted twice as many scandals. She'd been a fixture of London society since before Evelyn was born, and her opinion carried the weight of biblical decree among the ton. Evelyn had spent 2 weeks carefully arranging this invitation. She waited until the conversation turned naturally toward the war, toward Napoleon's exile and the relief of peace, before she made her move. When Lady Pemberton asked whether the Duke of Ashcombe would attend the upcoming parliamentary session on French reparations, Evelyn set down her teacup with a soft clink that drew every eye in the room. "I'm afraid my husband's position on France has become complicated," she said carefully. The silence that followed was exquisite. Lady Pemberton's eyebrows lifted fractionally. Complicated, she repeated. The word hung in the air like smoke. Evelyn smoothed her skirts and let the pause stretch just long enough to hurt. Yes, I've recently learned he maintained certain connections during the war that might prove embarrassing if they became public knowledge. She didn't say anything else, didn't elaborate or accuse or weep, just let that single poisoned sentence sink into the consciousness of every woman in the room. Within an hour, the whispers had started. By evening, they'd spread to the gentlemen's clubs where husbands gathered to drink and gossip like their wives. By the following morning, half of London's elite circles were quietly discussing the Duke of Ashcombe's mysterious French connections. Evelyn had planted the seed. Now she just had to water it and watch it grow into something that would strangle her husband's reputation completely. The next letter went to Lord Ashford, Cedric's primary political rival in Parliament. She didn't sign it, didn't need to. She simply included a carefully copied excerpt from one of Celeste's letters, the paragraph about troop movements near Calais, along with a brief note suggesting His Grace's loyalties during wartime might warrant closer examination. The third letter went to the editor of the London Chronicle, a scandal sheet that survived on aristocratic destruction and paid handsomely for information that could topple powerful men. Again, no signature, just facts. Dates, names, enough detail to make the accusation credible without revealing her hand. She mailed them from different locations across the city, always hooded, always alone, moving through London like a ghost bent on haunting one man back into the grave he'd dug for their marriage. Cedric noticed the shift in atmosphere before he understood what was causing it. He came home from Parliament one evening in early March looking confused and vaguely irritated, the expression of a man who'd walked into a room and found everyone staring at him without knowing why. Evelyn was reading in the library when he entered. She marked her page and looked up with practiced innocence. "Have you heard anything unusual lately?" he asked without preamble. "Any gossip about our family?" She tilted her head slightly. "What sort of gossip?" He paced across the room to the window, his jaw working like he was chewing through words he didn't want to say aloud. "There are rumors. Ridiculous ones. Something about French sympathies during the war." Evelyn kept her face carefully neutral. "That does sound ridiculous. What possible reason would anyone have to question your loyalty?" It wasn't a question. It was a dare wrapped in wifely concern, and for a moment she thought he might actually confess. His shoulders tensed, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Then he turned and looked at her directly for the first time in months, really looked at her, and she saw the moment calculation replace confusion in his eyes. He was trying to determine whether she knew something, whether this was connected to her somehow. She smiled and returned to her book. "I'm sure it's nothing," she said lightly. "You know how these things are. Someone probably misheard something at a dinner party and it spiraled into fiction. London thrives on manufactured drama." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Yes, of course. You're right." He left the room without another word. Evelyn waited until his footsteps faded down the hallway before she allowed herself to breathe. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to set the book aside. This was the dangerous part, the moment where Cedric might start connecting pieces, where he might think to check his study, to verify the letters were still hidden where he'd left them. But men like Cedric never expected their wives to be strategic. They expected tears and accusations, emotional confrontations that could be smoothed over with apologies and expensive gifts. They never anticipated the kind of patient, methodical destruction that required months of careful planning. Evelyn had spent 7 years being underestimated. Now she was going to make that mistake cost him everything. The scandal broke wide open 3 days later when the London Chronicle published a front-page story titled "The Duke and the French Widow." The article was masterfully crafted, full of anonymous sources and carefully worded implications that stopped just short of actionable libel. It claimed Duke Ashcombe had maintained a romantic correspondence with a French woman throughout the war, that he'd provided her with financial support using questionable channels, and that his letters contained references to military intelligence that should never have left England's shores. The Chronicle stopped short of calling it treason. They didn't have to. London's elite could read between the lines. By noon, every gentleman's club in the city was buzzing with speculation. By evening, half of Parliament was calling for an investigation. By the following morning, Cedric Ashcombe's name had become synonymous with betrayal. Evelyn watched it all unfold from the safety of Ashcombe Manor, receiving visitors who came ostensibly to offer support, but really wanted to mine her for information about whether she'd known, whether she'd suspected, how she was coping with the revelation that her husband might be a traitor. She played the role of devastated wife with perfect precision. Pale face, trembling hands, just enough tears to seem genuine without crossing into theatrical. She let them comfort her while she carefully fed them additional details, small things, confirmations of rumors they'd already heard, tiny breadcrumbs that kept the story alive and growing. When Lady Pemberton arrived with a delegation of senior noblewomen, Evelyn nearly broke character from the sheer satisfaction of it. "My dear child," Lady Pemberton said, settling into the drawing room like a general preparing to direct a siege. "We've come to discuss your position in all of this. Your reputation must be protected." Evelyn dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I appreciate your concern, but I hardly know what to believe myself. Cedric insists it's all a misunderstanding, but—" She let the sentence die unfinished. The women leaned forward unconsciously, hungry for more. "But you have doubts," Lady Pemberton said. It wasn't a question. Evelyn met her eyes and saw understanding pass between them, the recognition of one predator acknowledging another. "I found letters," she said quietly, "hidden in his study. I didn't read them all, couldn't bear to, but what I saw—" The room exploded into carefully modulated outrage. The women demanded details, offered sympathy, suggested courses of action that ranged from immediate separation to public denunciation. Evelyn let them talk, absorbing their fury and redirecting it like she was conducting an orchestra of destruction. By the time they left 2 hours later, she knew the narrative was set. She wasn't the wife who'd destroyed her husband out of revenge. She was the innocent victim, the patriotic Englishwoman who'd done her duty by exposing treachery even when it shattered her own life in the process. The next day, Lord Ashford stood before Parliament and called for a formal investigation into the Duke of Ashcombe's wartime activities. Cedric tried to fight back. He released a statement claiming the letters were personal correspondence that had been deliberately misconstrued, that Celeste Moreau was a former acquaintance trapped in France after the war began, that he'd sent money purely out of humanitarian concern for a woman who had no connection to military or political matters. Nobody believed him. The problem wasn't what the letters actually said. The problem was the climate of rage and paranoia that had gripped England since Napoleon's defeat. The country had spent years bleeding money and lives into a war that had touched nearly every family in the kingdom. The idea that one of their own dukes, a man who'd sat in Parliament voting for continued aggression while British soldiers died in French mud, had been sending money and information to a French mistress was too perfect a target for the collective fury to pass up. It didn't matter whether Cedric had actually committed treason. What mattered was that people wanted to believe he had, needed to believe it, because it gave them someone to blame for all the pain and loss the war had cost them. Evelyn understood this instinctively. She'd spent 7 years studying the mechanics of aristocratic society, learning how reputation worked as currency, how public opinion could be shaped and directed like water through channels. She'd simply never had a reason to use that knowledge as a weapon until now. The investigation moved forward with brutal efficiency. Within a week, Crown investigators had obtained warrants to search Ashcombe Manor. Cedric tried to stop them, but his political allies had already started abandoning him, terrified that association with potential treason would contaminate their own reputations. When the investigators arrived, Evelyn greeted them at the door herself. She led them directly to Cedric's study, showed them exactly where the floorboards lifted, watched their faces as they opened the box and began reading through the letters that would end her husband's life as he knew it. Cedric wasn't home when they found the evidence. He'd gone to Parliament to try desperately to salvage what remained of his political standing. When he returned that evening and found his study crawling with Crown investigators, Evelyn was waiting in the hallway. Their eyes met across the chaos of men cataloging his correspondence and stripping his sanctuary of privacy. For a moment, just a heartbeat, she saw him understand. Saw the realization crash through him like a wave breaking against cliffs, the knowledge that this wasn't random misfortune or political opportunism. This was her. His face went white, then red, then settled into something that looked almost like respect beneath the fury. "You," he said, It was barely a whisper, but she heard it clearly over the noise of investigation destroying his world. She didn't smile, didn't nod, just held his gaze and let him see exactly who he'd underestimated for 7 years. Then she turned and walked away, her silk skirts whispering against the marble floor, like a verdict being read aloud. The formal charges came 3 days later. Not treason. The Crown's lawyers were too careful for that, too aware that proving treasonous intent would require evidence they didn't quite have. Instead, they charged him with violations of wartime financial regulations, unauthorized correspondence with enemy nationals, and reckless disclosure of sensitive information. The penalties were severe enough: stripping of his parliamentary seat, heavy fines, complete withdrawal of royal favor and access to court. Cedric fought it, hired the best lawyers money could buy, called in every favor he'd accumulated over 2 decades of political maneuvering. But the tide of public opinion had turned too decisively against him. The newspapers kept the story alive with daily updates and editorials questioning how deeply the rot of French influence had penetrated England's noble houses. Cartoons appeared showing Cedric dressed in French military uniform, whispering secrets to a woman labeled Liberty while British soldiers died in the background. His family turned on him faster than Evelyn had anticipated. His elder brother issued a public statement condemning Cedric's actions and announcing the family would provide full cooperation with Crown investigators. His mother refused to see him. Cousins and distant relations who'd spent years trading on the Ashcombe name suddenly developed convenient amnesia about their connection to the disgraced Duke. Within 2 weeks, Cedric Ashcombe had gone from one of the most powerful men in England to a pariah nobody would defend publicly. And through it all, Evelyn maintained her performance as the betrayed wife. She gave one carefully crafted interview to a respectable newspaper, speaking in measured tones about duty and patriotism, about how discovering her husband's betrayal had broken her heart. But she could never have stayed silent when England's honor was at stake. The interview made her a hero. Women's societies praised her courage. The Crown sent a private letter thanking her for her service to the kingdom. Invitations flooded in from hostesses who wanted to associate themselves with the woman who'd exposed a traitor at great personal cost. She accepted none of them. Instead, she filed for divorce. The papers went through with shocking speed. No one questioned her grounds. No one suggested reconciliation. The scandal was too complete, Cedric's position too shattered, the optics too perfect. Within 6 weeks of that first whisper in Lady Pemberton's drawing room, Evelyn's marriage was legally dissolved and she'd been granted full control of the Ashcombe estate as compensation for the damage to her reputation and the trauma of discovering her husband's betrayal. Cedric signed the papers without fighting. What was the point? He'd already lost everything else. The day the divorce became final, Evelyn stood in what had been their bedroom and packed his remaining possessions into trunks. She worked methodically, without sentiment, removing every trace of him from rooms that would now belong only to her. She found one last letter from Celeste at the bottom of his wardrobe, hidden inside a book of poetry. This one was recent, dated just weeks before Evelyn had found the others. It was shorter than the rest, almost perfunctory, and as Evelyn read it, she felt something cold settle in her chest. Cedric, I received your last letter with concern. You must stop this fantasy of a future together. I have tried to tell you gently, but you refuse to hear. What we shared was years ago, before the war, before circumstances made continuation impossible. The funds you send are appreciated but unnecessary. I have rebuilt my life here and have no intention of abandoning France for England, regardless of what the peace treaties allow. You have been kind to me, and I remember our time together fondly, but I think you have built our brief romance into something it never was. Please, for both our sakes, let this correspondence end. I wish you well in your marriage and your political career. That is where your focus should remain. C. Evelyn read it twice, then set it carefully on the bed. So Cedric hadn't just betrayed her with an ongoing affair. He'd been clinging to the memory of something that had ended years ago, pouring money and devotion into a fantasy relationship, while the real woman on the receiving end had been trying politely to make him stop. The revelation should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it just made the whole thing feel more pathetic and wasteful. She'd destroyed her husband over letters to a woman who didn't even want him anymore. For a moment, standing alone in that bedroom, surrounded by packed trunks and empty drawers, Evelyn felt something that might have been regret. Then she remembered 7 years of loneliness, 7 years of being invisible while Cedric mourned a romance that had existed more in his imagination than reality. 7 years of being the obligation while some phantom woman in Paris represented everything he'd convinced himself he couldn't have. The regret hardened back into something colder and more permanent. She burned Celeste's final letter in the fireplace and finished packing. Cedric left Ashcombe Manor on a gray morning in late April with 3 trunks and a hired carriage that would take him to Dover, then across the Channel to wherever men went when they'd been expelled from everything they'd ever known. Evelyn didn't watch him go. She was in the library reviewing estate accounts with her new solicitor, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Hartwell, who'd built a practice helping widows and divorced women navigate the legal complexities of suddenly managing their own property. Through the window, she could hear the crunch of carriage wheels on gravel, the murmur of servants loading luggage, the sounds of departure that would leave her alone in a house that had always felt empty anyway. When the noise finally faded and silence settled back over the manor, Mrs. Hartwell looked up from her papers. "That's done then," she said quietly. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, that's done." Mrs. Hartwell studied her for a moment with something that might have been sympathy or respect, or both. "You did the right thing," she said. "Whatever people might whisper privately, you chose your country over a man who'd betrayed it. That takes courage." Evelyn didn't respond. She'd heard variations of that sentiment so many times in recent weeks it had stopped meaning anything. Because the truth was, she hadn't destroyed Cedric for England. She'd destroyed him because he'd humiliated her, because he'd made her feel invisible and worthless, because after 7 years of marriage, she'd finally been handed the weapon to hurt him the way he'd hurt her, and she'd used it without hesitation. Patriotism was just the costume she'd dressed that revenge in so society would applaud instead of condemn. Mrs. Hartwell was waiting for some kind of response, so Evelyn gave her a tired smile. "Thank you. I appreciate your help navigating all of this." They returned to reviewing accounts. Numbers that represented Cedric's former life being systematically converted into Evelyn's future. Properties that would now carry only her name. Investments she'd have sole control over. The mathematical architecture of freedom bought with someone else's ruin. That night, alone in the manor for the first time since becoming Duchess of Ashcombe 7 years earlier, Evelyn walked through rooms that suddenly felt enormous and suffocating at once. She'd won. She'd executed a perfect campaign of destruction and emerged victorious with everything she'd wanted: independence, wealth, respect, the satisfaction of watching the man who'd ignored her spend 7 years reduced to nothing. So why did it feel like she'd simply traded one kind of loneliness for another? She poured herself a glass of wine she didn't drink and stood at the window of what had been Cedric's study, looking out at grounds that stretched into darkness. Somewhere out there, probably on a ship crossing the Channel, her former husband was beginning whatever life awaited men who'd lost everything. She wondered if he was thinking about her, if he understood yet that the quiet, obedient wife he'd barely noticed had been studying him the whole time, learning his weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She wondered if Celeste had heard about the scandal, if the Frenchwoman felt any guilt for the letters that had ended up destroying a man who'd loved her longer and more desperately than she'd ever wanted to be loved. Then Evelyn turned from the window and went to bed because wondering changed nothing and she had an estate to run in the morning. 3 weeks later, she received a letter. It arrived without ceremony, delivered by regular post along with invitations to parties and requests for charitable contributions. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakably Cedric's. She'd seen it enough times on household correspondence to recognize the particular slant of his letters. She almost burned it unopened. Instead, she sat down at her desk with a letter opener and sliced through the seal, pulling out 2 pages of writing that looked like they'd been composed in stages, the ink quality changing partway through like he'd had to stop and start again. "Evelyn, I don't expect you to read this. I'm not certain I even expect you to open it. But I find myself in a small room in Calais with nothing but time and questions, so I'm writing anyway. I know what you did. Not immediately. I'll spare you the tedious details of how long it took me to piece everything together, how many nights I spent reconstructing the timeline and watching your perfect performance unspool in retrospect. But eventually the picture became clear. The leaked letters, the strategic whispers, the convenient timing of every damaging revelation. You orchestrated all of it with a precision I should have anticipated if I'd bothered to actually see you at any point during our marriage. I should hate you for it. Part of me does. Part of me will probably spend the rest of my life furious at the scale of destruction you wrought. But another part, the part writing this letter, feels something closer to admiration. You outplayed me completely. I never saw it coming until it had already destroyed everything. What haunts me now, sitting in this rented room, listening to French voices in the street below, is trying to understand when exactly I lost you. Was it a single moment, a specific cruelty or neglect that crossed some line I didn't know existed? Or was it gradual, 7 years of small dismissals accumulating into something that couldn't be forgiven or forgotten? I've been going through my memories of our marriage like examining a puzzle with half the pieces missing. I remember our wedding, remember thinking you looked terrified beneath your composure. I remember the first year when you tried so hard to engage me in conversation over dinner, and I was always too preoccupied with parliamentary business to really listen. I remember the way your face changed over time, how the hope in your eyes when you looked at me gradually calcified into something harder. And I remember doing nothing about any of it because I'd convinced myself our marriage was exactly what it was supposed to be. A functional arrangement between families, not a romance. The letters to Celeste that you found, those were the remnants of something that ended years before I even met you. She was right in that final letter you probably discovered, the one where she told me to stop living in the past. We had a brief affair when I was younger, stationed in Paris before the wars began. She was extraordinary, and I was lonely, and for a few months I experienced something that felt like the kind of passion people write novels about. Then circumstances separated us and real life reasserted itself. I came back to England, inherited the title, did what dukes do. Married appropriately. Built a political career, became the person everyone expected me to be. But I never quite let go of the memory of who I'd been with Celeste, how alive everything had felt during those months. So I wrote to her. Even after she made it clear she'd moved on, I kept writing like a fool, pouring everything I was too cowardly to feel in my actual life into letters to a woman who'd long since stopped wanting them. I didn't betray you with an ongoing affair, Evelyn. I betrayed you with something potentially worse, the ghost of a relationship I'd turned into an excuse for why I couldn't fully engage with the real person I'd actually married. You were right there. For 7 years you were right there, and I was too busy mourning a fantasy to notice you. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything really, except maybe the small mercy of you knowing that I understand now what I failed to see then. You deserved better than what I gave you. You deserved a husband who actually looked at you, who valued your mind and your company, who understood that marriage could have been a partnership instead of parallel loneliness. By the time I realized any of this, you'd already set everything in motion. And honestly, I can't blame you. You used the only weapon I was careless enough to leave within your reach, and you used it perfectly. So this letter isn't an appeal or an accusation. It's just acknowledgement, I suppose, of your victory, of my failure, of the fact that somewhere in 7 years of living in the same house we became enemies without my ever noticing we'd stopped being strangers. I'm leaving France tomorrow, heading somewhere farther away where the name Ashcombe doesn't carry the weight of scandal. I don't know what happens next. I suppose I'll have to learn how to be someone other than a duke, since that identity no longer exists. I hope the manor treats you well. I hope you find whatever it is you were looking for when you decided to destroy me. And I hope, someday, the victory feels like more than just a different flavor of emptiness. See, Evelyn read the letter 3 times. Then she walked to the fireplace, knelt down, and held it over the flames until it caught and burned. She watched the paper blacken and curl, watched Cedric's words disappear into ash and smoke, and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, no regret. Just the hollow quiet of a woman standing alone in a house full of rooms that would never be warm enough to chase away the cold that had settled into her bones somewhere during 7 years of being invisible. Outside, summer was beginning to announce itself in the gardens. Soon there would be parties to attend, estate business to manage, the architecture of her new life as an independent woman to construct from the ruins of everything that had come before. But tonight, she just stood there watching the last fragments of her former husband's letter turn to ash and wondered whether winning was supposed to feel this much like losing. The flames died down. The room settled back into silence, and somewhere across the channel, in a small coastal town whose name she'd never know, Cedric Ashcombe began the long process of learning how to disappear into the kind of obscurity that swallows men who've lost the only identity they ever knew how to perform. While in London, in a manor that bore his family's name but no longer contained any trace of his presence, his former wife finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding since the night she found those letters. She hadn't destroyed Cedric to save England or defend her honor or even to get revenge for his betrayal. She'd destroyed him because watching him suffer was the only way she'd been able to make him finally, truly see her. And now that he did, now that he understood exactly who she was and what she was capable of, there was no one left to witness it except empty rooms and her own reflection staring back from darkened windows. The fire went out completely. Evelyn stood alone in the darkness and waited for morning to come, because morning always came, and with it would arrive letters requiring responses and decisions requiring judgment and all the machinery of life that continued regardless of whether you'd won or lost the private wars that consumed everything you used to be. She'd rebuilt the Ashcombe name, secured her independence, proven that intelligence could defeat power when wielded with enough patience and precision. All she'd had to sacrifice in exchange was any remaining illusion that victory could fill the space where love was supposed to live. The clock in the hallway struck midnight, each chime echoing through the manor like a heartbeat that belonged to the house itself rather than anyone living inside it. And in the study where this had all begun, where Cedric's letters had waited beneath floorboards for someone to find them and transform them into weapons, the hidden space lay empty now, cleaned out, catalogued, stripped of secrets, just like everything else. The invitation arrived on thick cream paper, the kind that cost more per sheet than most families spent on a week's groceries. Evelyn held it up to the morning light streaming through the library windows and read the embossed script twice to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. The Honourable Society of London cordially invites Duchess Evelyn Ashcombe to deliver the keynote address at the annual Ladies' Parliament on the subject of duty, patriotism, and the modern woman's role in safeguarding England's future. She set it down on her desk and laughed. Actually laughed, a sound so unexpected in the silence of the manor that it startled her. 6 months ago, she'd been the invisible wife of a powerful duke, a decorative element in someone else's life story. Now she was being asked to stand before London's most influential women and lecture them on moral courage. The transformation was so absurd it bordered on obscene. Mrs. Hartwell noticed the invitation during their weekly estate review later that morning. She picked it up without asking permission, read it, and raised an eyebrow that conveyed more skepticism than most people manage with entire speeches. "Are you going to accept?" she asked. Evelyn had been asking herself the same question since the envelope arrived. Part of her wanted to refuse out of sheer spite for the hypocrisy of it all. These were the same women who'd spent years gossiping about her childless marriage, who'd whispered that she must be barren or cold or somehow deficient because she couldn't seem to hold her husband's attention. Now they wanted her wisdom. But another part of her, the part that had learned to weaponize social capital during 7 years of studying aristocratic warfare, recognized the opportunity. Every public appearance cemented her new identity. Every speech transformed her from victim into authority. The more visible she became as the woman who'd chosen country over husband, the harder it would be for anyone to question the narrative she'd constructed. "Yes," she told Mrs. Hartwell. "I'll accept." The older woman nodded approvingly. "Good. You've earned the platform. Might as well use it." Evelyn spent the next week drafting remarks that walked the razor edge between inspiration and manipulation. She wrote about discovering betrayal and choosing principle over personal comfort. She invoked the sacrifices of soldiers' widows and mothers who'd lost sons to French artillery. She never once mentioned that her motivation had been rage rather than patriotism, that she'd destroyed Cedric because he'd made her feel worthless, not because he'd endangered England. The speech was a masterpiece of calculated deception dressed up as moral courage. She practiced it alone in the library, adjusting emphasis and pacing until the lies sounded indistinguishable from conviction. By the time she delivered it 3 weeks later to a ballroom packed with London's elite women, she almost believed it herself. The applause when she finished was thunderous. Afterward, women lined up to shake her hand and thank her for her bravery. Young debutantes stared at her with something approaching worship. Lady Pemberton herself pulled Evelyn aside and told her she'd done more for women's moral authority in one speech than a decade of charitable committees. Evelyn smiled and accepted their praise while feeling absolutely nothing except the cold satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. She'd become exactly what she'd set out to be: untouchable, respected, free. So why did success taste like ashes in her mouth? Sis. The letter from Cedric's brother arrived 2 months later, forwarded through 3 different solicitors before finally reaching her desk. Arthur Ashcombe had always been the responsible one, the elder brother who'd inherited the family's sense of duty along with their father's estates in Yorkshire. He'd issued that public condemnation of Cedric during the height of the scandal, distancing himself with surgical precision from the brother whose disgrace threatened to contaminate the entire family line. Now apparently, he wanted something. Evelyn broke the seal and scanned the contents with growing disbelief. Duchess Ashcombe, I write regarding a matter of considerable delicacy concerning the Ashcombe family interests. As you are aware, my brother's disgrace has created certain complications in our financial arrangements, particularly regarding properties held jointly between the London estates and our holdings in the north. There exists a parcel of land in Yorkshire, approximately 400 acres bordering the River Ouse, which was designated as part of Cedric's marriage settlement with you. Under normal circumstances, this would have been transferred to your control following the divorce. However, given the unique nature of the property's historical designation and their importance to our family's agricultural operations, I am writing to propose an alternative arrangement. I would like to purchase this land from you at fair market value, plus an additional premium of 20% to acknowledge the inconvenience of separating it from the broader estate holdings. This would provide you with immediate capital while allowing the family to maintain continuity of our northern operations. I recognize this request comes at a sensitive time. However, I believe we can approach this as a straightforward business transaction between reasonable parties, setting aside the unfortunate circumstances that preceded it. I await your response at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Arthur Ashcombe. Evelyn read the letter 3 times, her jaw tightening with each pass. The audacity of it was almost impressive. Arthur had publicly gutted his own brother to protect the family name, had let Cedric twist in the wind of scandal without offering a single word of private support, and now he wanted to negotiate property deals like they were friendly business associates. The land he was talking about was worth considerably more than he was offering, premium or not. She'd had it appraised during the divorce proceedings. It included water rights, timber stands, and access to transportation routes that made it valuable far beyond its agricultural use. Arthur knew this. He was counting on her being too inexperienced or too grateful for social acceptance to recognize she was being lowballed. He'd made a mistake. She called for Mrs. Hartwell immediately. The solicitor arrived within the hour, read Arthur's letter, and smiled the predatory smile of someone who'd spent decades watching men underestimate women in business negotiations. "He thinks you're stupid," Mrs. Hartwell said flatly. "Thinks because you expose Cedric for patriotic reasons, you'll be equally cooperative with the family that abandoned him. Wants the land for a fraction of its worth and expects you to be grateful for the attention." "What's it actually worth?" Evelyn asked. Mrs. Hartwell pulled out her notes. "Based on current market assessments and the development potential of the river access conservatively, triple what he's offering. Maybe quadruple if you're willing to hold it for 5 years and let the rail expansion plan solidify." Evelyn felt something cold and sharp settle in her chest. Not anger exactly, something more focused. The same feeling she'd had when she first discovered Cedric's letters and realized she was holding a weapon. "Draft a response," she told Mrs. Hartwell. "Polite but firm. Inform Mr. Ashcombe that I've had the property independently appraised and his offer substantially undervalues the asset. I'm willing to sell, but at fair market rate with no family discount. If he declines, I'm equally comfortable developing the land independently or finding other buyers." Mrs. Hartwell's smile widened. "It will be my pleasure." The response went out that afternoon. Arthur's reply came back within 2 days, the speed of it betraying how much he actually needed that land. "Duchess Ashcombe, I confess surprise at your response. The premium I offered was intended as a gesture of goodwill between families, but I see now you prefer to approach this as a pure business transaction. While I believe your appraisers may have been overly optimistic about the property's development potential, I am willing to negotiate in good faith." Might I suggest we meet in person to discuss terms? I will be in London next week for parliamentary sessions and would welcome the opportunity to resolve this matter efficiently. Respectfully, Arthur Ashcombe. The meeting took place in the library at Ashcombe Manor, the same room where Evelyn had spent 7 years being ignored by one Ashcombe brother. Now she sat across a desk from the other one, watching him try to calculate how much of his younger sibling's destruction had been her doing versus opportunistic timing. Arthur was older than Cedric by 5 years, broader in the shoulders, harder in the eyes. He had the look of a man who'd spent his life managing estates and expecting deference, who viewed business negotiations as battles to be won through superior position and force of will. He was about to learn that superior position meant nothing when your opponent had already decided she didn't give a damn about his goodwill. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Arthur began, settling into the chair across from her like he was doing her a favor by showing up. "I believe we can resolve this matter quickly to our mutual satisfaction." Evelyn folded her hands on the desk and said nothing. The silence stretched. Arthur shifted slightly, recalibrated. "As I mentioned in my letter, the Yorkshire property has considerable sentimental value to our family. My father expanded those holdings specifically to secure our agricultural independence. Keeping them consolidated under family control honors his legacy." "How touching," Evelyn said. Her voice was pleasant, conversational. "Unfortunately, sentiment doesn't pay market rates." Arthur's jaw tightened fractionally. "I'm prepared to offer a fair price." "You offered 60% of fair value," Evelyn corrected, "then called it generous because you assumed I wouldn't know better." The air in the room changed. Arthur's eyes went cold and assessing, the look of a man realizing he'd walked into an ambush. "I see my brother wasn't the only one underestimating you," he said carefully. "Your brother never estimated me at all," Evelyn replied. "He simply assumed I didn't exist as anything beyond furniture. You're making a different mistake, assuming that because I'm a woman I'll prioritize family harmony over my own financial interests. But here's what you don't seem to understand, Mr. Ashcombe. I don't have any family harmony to protect. Your brother made sure of that when he spent 7 years treating our marriage like an inconvenience. You made sure of it when you issued that public statement cutting him loose to protect your own reputation. So the Ashcombe family legacy means precisely nothing to me beyond whatever price I can extract from it." Arthur stared at her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he laughed, a short, sharp bark of sound that held more respect than warmth. "Christ," he said. "Cedric really did step on a landmine when he married you." "He stepped on nothing," Evelyn said. "I built the landmine, placed it carefully, and waited for him to provide the pressure needed to detonate it. Everything that happened to your brother was my doing, Mr. Ashcombe. I don't pretend otherwise. So when you sit across from me trying to negotiate like I'm some wounded widow who'll settle for crumbs and gratitude, understand that you're dealing with the woman who destroyed the last man who underestimated her. Now, would you like to make a serious offer, or shall we end this meeting?" The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of servants moving through the house. Arthur studied her face like he was seeing her for the first time, reassessing everything he'd assumed about the quiet Duchess who'd exposed a traitor and emerged victorious. She could see the calculations running behind his eyes, whether to be offended, whether to walk away, whether this woman across the desk was someone he could afford to make an enemy of. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly. "Fair market value," he said. "As determined by independent appraisal from an assessor, we both agree on. Plus 5% to acknowledge the administrative complexity of the transfer." "Plus 15%, Evelyn countered, "and I select the appraiser from a list of 3 candidates you provide." 10%, Arthur said. "And we split the selection. You eliminate one, I eliminate one, we hire whoever remains." Evelyn considered this. It was a reasonable compromise, which meant Arthur had come prepared to negotiate, and the number in his first letter had been pure theater. The realization made her like him slightly better. At least he was honest about being dishonest. "Acceptable," she said. "Draft the agreement and have your solicitor send it to Mrs. Hartwell for review." Arthur stood, straightening his coat. "You know," he said, almost conversationally, "I actually feel sorry for Cedric now. Poor bastard never stood a chance." "Your brother stood every chance," Evelyn said. "He just chose to spend 7 years ignoring all of them." Arthur studied her a moment longer, then nodded once and left. Evelyn sat alone in the library for a long time after he'd gone, listening to the house settle around her. She'd just negotiated her first major business deal, gone head-to-head with a man who'd spent 40 years managing estates and political relationships, and come out ahead. The victory should have felt triumphant. Instead, it just felt like confirmation of something she'd started to suspect during the long months since the divorce. She was good at this. The strategy, the manipulation, the careful construction of leverage, and the ruthless application of it. She'd spent 7 years watching Cedric play political games from the sidelines, absorbing the mechanics of power by osmosis. Now that she had the freedom to use those skills herself, she was discovering she had a natural talent for the kind of calculated warfare that happened in drawing rooms and parliamentary chambers. The problem was, she'd discovered this talent in service of destroying her own life. And now that the destruction was complete, now that she had independence and wealth and respect, she wasn't sure what she was supposed to do with any of it except find new targets for the anger that had fueled everything. Mrs. Hartwell arrived an hour later to begin drafting the property agreement. They worked through dinner, hammering out language that would protect Evelyn's interests while giving Arthur the land consolidation he needed. When they finally finished, well past midnight, Mrs. Hartwell gathered her papers and paused at the door. "You handled him well," she said. "Better than well. You're developing quite a reputation as someone not to be trifled with in business negotiations." "Is that a compliment or a warning?" Evelyn asked. Mrs. Hartwell smiled. "Both. There's a narrow path for women in our position, Duchess. Too soft and we get exploited. Too hard and we get labeled difficult, which closes doors we might need open later. You're walking that line well so far. Just remember it exists." After she left, Evelyn climbed the stairs to her bedroom, exhausted but unable to imagine sleeping. Her mind was still running through the negotiation, analyzing what she'd said, how Arthur had responded, where she might have pushed harder or conceded less. She was becoming someone new, someone harder and sharper, and infinitely more dangerous than the girl who'd married Cedric Ashcombe 7 years ago, believing duty might transform into affection. The question was whether this new version of herself was an improvement or just a different flavor of broken. The scandal broke 3 weeks later in a way Evelyn never anticipated. She was having breakfast when Mrs. Hartwell arrived unannounced, her face tight with something that looked like controlled fury. She threw a newspaper onto the table hard enough to rattle the teacup. "Have you seen this?" she demanded. Evelyn picked up the paper. It was the London Observer, a respectable publication that normally avoided the kind of sensational scandal-mongering that had destroyed Cedric, but the headline on the front page made her stomach drop. "The Duchess's Revenge. New evidence suggests Ashcombe scandal was personal vendetta, not patriotic duty." She read the article with growing horror and disbelief. It claimed to have spoken with anonymous sources close to the Ashcombe family who confirmed that Evelyn had discovered the letters months before reporting them to authorities, that she'd deliberately leaked information to create maximum damage, that her entire performance as wounded patriot had been calculated theater designed to destroy her husband while protecting her own reputation. The article stopped just short of calling the treason charges fabricated, but it heavily implied that Evelyn had manipulated evidence and public opinion to turn a marital dispute into a political scandal. Every word was true, and every word would destroy her if people believed it. "Who did this?" Evelyn asked quietly. Mrs. Hartwell's expression was grim. "Best guess? Someone in Cedric's circle who wants to rehabilitate his reputation, or someone who resents your growing influence and wants to cut you down. Could be Arthur, angry about the property negotiation. Could be any of a dozen political enemies Cedric made who now see an opportunity to rewrite the narrative. Does it matter?" It mattered because Evelyn needed to know who she was fighting. But Mrs. Hartwell was right that the immediate threat was the same regardless of source. Her carefully constructed identity as moral hero was being dismantled in print for half of London to see. "What do we do?" she asked. Mrs. Hartwell pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. "We have 2 options. First, ignore it completely. Refuse to dignify the accusations with a response. Hope that your established reputation is strong enough to weather one negative article. And second, fight back. Issue a statement. Call the article defamatory. Threaten legal action. Force them to prove their claims or retract them." Evelyn stared at the newspaper, her mind racing through scenarios and consequences. Ignoring the article might work if this was an isolated attack. But if whoever was behind it had more ammunition, more sources willing to talk, staying silent would look like admission of guilt. But fighting back meant escalating, meant drawing more attention to questions she absolutely could not afford to have people asking too loudly. Before she could decide, a second problem arrived in the form of a hand-delivered letter from Lady Pemberton. My dear Duchess, I trust you have seen this morning's Observer article. While I personally give it little credence, I felt it important to inform you that several members of the Ladies' Parliament Committee have expressed concern about the timing of your recent address. There's talk of requesting you step back from public speaking engagements until this matter is resolved, to avoid any appearance of impropriety. I oppose this suggestion strenuously, but I wanted you to be aware of the shifting winds. Please call on me at your earliest convenience so we might discuss how to address this situation before it escalates further. With sincere concern, Margaret Pemberton. Evelyn set the letter down carefully, fighting the urge to crumple it into a ball and throw it against the wall. This was the mechanism of her destruction being assembled in real time. The whisper campaign, the concerned friends, the gradual withdrawal of support from people who'd praised her weeks earlier. She'd used the exact same strategy against Cedric. Now someone was using it against her. We fight back, she told Mrs. Hartwell. Draft a statement calling the article defamatory and demanding retraction, but keep it measured. Outraged, but not desperate. Mrs. Hartwell nodded and stood. I'll have something for your review by this afternoon. After she left, Evelyn sat alone in the breakfast room, staring at the newspaper article that was threatening to unravel everything she'd built. Somewhere out there, someone had decided she'd risen too far too fast, that she needed to be reminded of her place. They were about to learn that the woman who destroyed a duke wasn't going to be intimidated by newspaper articles. But first, she needed to find out who was behind this before they could fire the next shot. She spent the afternoon making calls to every contact she'd cultivated over the past year. Editors, socialites, political wives who traded in gossip and information. By evening, she had 3 names of people who'd been asking questions about her relationship with Cedric before the scandal broke. By midnight, Mrs. Hartwell had tracked 2 of them back to a single source. Lord Ashford, Cedric's old political rival. The man who'd seized on the treason accusations to call for investigation. The man who'd benefited most from Cedric's fall, stepping into parliamentary positions his rival had once held. Evelyn should have seen it coming. Ashford had never cared about justice or patriotism. He'd cared about eliminating competition. And now that Cedric was gone, now that Evelyn was starting to build her own influence in social and political circles, she represented a new kind of threat. A woman with Cedric's intelligence and none of his weaknesses. Someone who'd proven she could destroy powerful men when they underestimated her. Ashford wanted her neutralized before she became dangerous enough to threaten him directly. The realization brought a cold clarity that felt almost peaceful. This wasn't about the past anymore. This was about the future she was trying to build, and the people who wanted to make sure she failed. She could retreat, accept the social exile, let her reputation be shredded and disappear into the kind of quiet obscurity that swallowed disgraced women. Or she could fight. The decision took approximately 3 seconds. She called for Mrs. Hartwell again, this time with specific instructions. They were going to war. The counterattack launched 2 days later in 3 coordinated strikes. First, Mrs. Hartwell leaked information to friendly journalists about Lord Ashford's financial dealings during the war. Specifically, contracts he'd awarded to his brother-in-law's shipping company at inflated rates while British supply lines were failing. Nothing provably illegal, but enough to raise questions about his own patriotism and profit motives. Second, Evelyn personally called on Lady Pemberton with a proposition. She would fund a new wing of the Women's Hospital charity that Lady Pemberton chaired, a substantial donation that would cement Evelyn's reputation as a serious philanthropist. In exchange, Lady Pemberton would publicly defend Evelyn against the Observer article and use her influence to kill the proposal about limiting Evelyn's speaking engagements. Lady Pemberton agreed before Evelyn finished explaining the terms. Money, as always, spoke louder than scandal. Third, and most dangerously, Evelyn authorized Mrs. Hartwell to approach the Observer's editor with a different story. One about how Lord Ashford had pressured sources to fabricate allegations against the Duchess of Ashcombe as part of a political vendetta. They had circumstantial evidence, testimony from one of the anonymous sources Ashford had recruited who was now having second thoughts. It was thin, it might not hold up under scrutiny, but it didn't have to be bulletproof. It just had to create enough doubt to muddy the waters, to make people question whether the original article had been journalism or character assassination. The editor, sensing he'd been used as a weapon in someone else's fight, was angry enough to listen. Within a week, the narrative had shifted again. Now both sides looked suspect. Ashford trying to destroy a rival, Evelyn possibly having orchestrated a revenge plot. The truth was buried somewhere in the middle, but nobody could prove anything definitively, which meant the stalemate favored Evelyn. She'd been the victim first in public perception. Ashford was the attacker trying to tear down a woman who'd already suffered. As long as she could maintain that position, she'd survive. But the cost was becoming clear. Every day brought new battles, new articles to refute or ignore, new social events where she had to smile and charm while knowing half the room was whispering about whether she'd fabricated treason charges, new negotiations and strategic alliances and careful deployments of money and influence to maintain position. She was winning. But winning required constant vigilance, constant strategy, constant manipulation of the same social systems that had nearly destroyed her. She was becoming the thing she'd fought against. A political operator who valued power over principle, who measured relationships in terms of utility rather than affection. The realization hit her during a particularly brutal committee meeting where she'd just outmaneuvered 3 women who'd been trying to exclude her from a charitable board. She'd done it perfectly. Used parliamentary procedure and social pressure and carefully deployed favors to force them into supporting her nomination. Afterward, walking back to her carriage, she caught her reflection in a shop window and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Hard eyes, tight mouth, the expression of someone perpetually calculating angles and leverage. When had she become this? The question haunted her through the ride home and into the evening. She'd destroyed Cedric to escape feeling invisible and powerless. But the person she'd become in the aftermath, the strategic, ruthless, perpetually armored version of herself, was visible for all the wrong reasons. People didn't see Evelyn Ashcombe anymore. They saw the Duchess who'd exposed a traitor. The woman who couldn't be trusted because she'd proven she was willing to destroy anyone who betrayed her. They respected her, feared her, wanted her on their side in fights. But nobody actually knew her. Nobody asked what she wanted beyond victory in whatever battle she was currently fighting. She'd traded being invisible in a marriage for being visible as a weapon. And she was starting to suspect that neither version was actually her, that the real Evelyn, if such a person had ever existed, had been buried somewhere beneath 7 years of loneliness and 6 months of warfare. That night she did something she hadn't done since the divorce. She pulled out a bottle of expensive whiskey Cedric had kept in his study, poured herself 3 fingers, and got methodically drunk alone in the library. The alcohol didn't help. It just made the walls feel closer and the silence louder. Somewhere around midnight, she found herself standing in what had been Cedric's study, staring at the floorboards where his letters had been hidden. She'd had them replaced during renovations, new wood that didn't carry the memory of betrayal. But she knew exactly which boards had lifted, could map the hiding place by muscle memory, even though no evidence remained. On impulse, she knelt down and pressed her palm against the wood. What had she actually won? Property. Money. Reputation as someone dangerous and capable. The respect of people she didn't particularly like. The fear of people who might have been friends if she'd been someone different. But she was alone in a house that felt emptier every day, surrounded by servants who were paid to care and social contacts who valued her utility. And she couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her a question that wasn't strategic. The whiskey made her maudlin. She recognized that. But maudlin didn't mean wrong. She'd broken Cedric to prove she could, to force him to see her, to make him pay for 7 years of invisibility. And she'd succeeded. Destroyed him so completely he'd fled the country in disgrace. The cost of that success was discovering she had a talent for destruction. And once you knew you were good at something, once you'd tasted the dark satisfaction of victory, it became harder to stop. Easier to identify the next target, the next person who underestimated you, or threatened your position, or simply existed as an obstacle to whatever you'd decided you wanted. She was becoming addicted to winning because winning was the only thing that made her feel anything except empty. The realization sobered her faster than coffee. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at grounds that had never felt like home, at gardens she'd inherited from Cedric's ancestors, along with their name and their money and their legacy of treating people as possessions. Tomorrow she would keep fighting, would continue the war with Ashford and whoever else decided she needed to be cut down. Would maintain her position through strategy and ruthlessness and whatever it took to survive. But tonight, alone in the darkness of a manor that belonged to her but would never actually be hers, Evelyn Ashcombe admitted something she would never say aloud to another living person. She'd won everything she thought she wanted, and it wasn't enough. Would never be enough. Because the hole inside her wasn't about power or money or reputation. It was about being seen. Actually seen. And she'd destroyed the only person who'd ever looked at her long enough to write her name on divorce papers. The whiskey bottle was still half full. She poured the rest down the sink and went to bed. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new strategies to deploy, new people to outmaneuver, because that's what winners did. They kept winning until there was nothing left to win and nobody left to fight. And then they stood alone in empty houses wondering whether victory was supposed to feel this much like losing. The letter arrived 3 months later, forwarded through so many intermediaries that the original postmark was illegible. Evelyn recognized the handwriting before she opened it. She almost threw it away unread. Almost. But curiosity or masochism or something darker made her break the seal and unfold the single page inside. Evelyn, I'm writing this from a village whose name you'll never know because I've learned that invisibility has its advantages. No one here knows I was a duke. No one cares about scandals in London or whether I betrayed England or what happened to my marriage. I'm simply the quiet Englishman who teaches languages to local children and keeps to himself. It's the most peaceful I've been in 20 years. I'm not writing for forgiveness or reconciliation or any of the dramatic reasons people write letters in novels. I'm writing because I heard about what happened with Ashford, the accusations, the counterattacks, the whole ugly spectacle of two people trying to destroy each other through newspaper articles and whisper campaigns. And I recognized it. The strategy, the precision, the way you moved pieces around until your opponent had nowhere safe to stand. It's the same thing you did to me, just faster and more refined. You're getting better at it. That should probably worry me more than it does. But from this distance, removed from everything that mattered when I was the Duke of Ashcombe, I find I'm mostly just sad. Because I understand now what I couldn't see when we were married. You never wanted to be invisible. You wanted to be known. Actually known. Beyond the decorative role society assigned you. And I was so busy mourning a fantasy relationship with a woman who'd moved on years ago that I never bothered to discover who you actually were. So you became someone I couldn't ignore. Someone dangerous enough to destroy me when I finally proved I would never willingly see you. The tragedy isn't that you succeeded. The tragedy is that you're so good at destruction, you'll keep using that skill against anyone who threatens you. Not because you want to, but because it's the only way you know how to feel powerful instead of invisible. Ashford won't be the last person you go to war with. There will always be another threat, another person who underestimates you or tries to cut you down. And you'll defeat them all with the same ruthless efficiency you used against me. But here's what I learned in the months since everything collapsed. Victory without purpose is just expensive loneliness. And revenge without limit is a cage that locks from the inside. I don't expect this letter to change anything. You made your choice when you decided invisibility was worse than war, and I don't blame you for it. I created the conditions that made that choice necessary. But I wanted you to know that somewhere in a small village a long way from London, the man whose life you dismantled hopes you eventually find whatever you were actually looking for when you set everything on fire. Because we both know it wasn't me. Wasn't Ashford. Wasn't any of the people you fought. It was always about being seen as yourself rather than as someone's property or threat or tool. I just wish you'd found a way to be visible without having to destroy everything around you to prove you existed. Be careful, Evelyn. The woman who taught me that invisibility hurts is becoming invisible herself behind walls of strategy and warfare. See. Evelyn read the letter twice. Then she walked to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched Cedric's words turn to ash for the second time. But this time, standing in the library of a manor she'd won through calculated destruction, She felt something crack in the armor she'd spent 6 months constructing. He was right. She'd won against Ashford, would probably win against whoever came next, would keep winning until she'd outlasted or outmaneuvered every person who dared to threaten her position. And then she'd stand alone in this enormous house, surrounded by expensive furniture and hard-won respect, and the hollow satisfaction of being visible as something sharp and dangerous, instead of invisible as something human. The fire consumed the last traces of Cedric's letter. The room settled back into silence. Outside, London continued its endless churn of scandal and ambition, of people climbing over each other toward whatever they believed would finally make them feel complete. Evelyn stood at the window and watched the sun set over a city that respected her and feared her and didn't know the first true thing about who she was beneath the armor. She'd destroyed her husband to escape being invisible, built a reputation as someone dangerous to ensure she'd never be ignored again, fought battles and won victories and proven she could survive anything as long as she was willing to be ruthless enough. But Cedric's letter had named the things she'd been trying not to acknowledge for months. She was more alone now than she'd ever been during their marriage. Because back then, she'd at least had the possibility of being seen, the hope that maybe if she tried hard enough or waited long enough, someone would finally notice her. Now people noticed her constantly. They just saw a weapon instead of a woman, a threat instead of a person. The Duchess who'd exposed a traitor instead of Evelyn, whoever that had been before 7 years of invisibility, taught her that being dangerous was safer than being vulnerable. She'd won the war against Cedric, was winning the war against Ashford, would probably win every war that followed. But at some point, victory stopped being about the battle and started being about whether you recognized yourself when you looked in the mirror afterward. Evelyn turned from the window and looked at her reflection in the darkened glass. Hard eyes, tight expression, the face of someone perpetually braced for attack. The woman staring back was powerful, wealthy, respected, untouchable, and completely, devastatingly alone. The question she'd been avoiding for months finally demanded an answer. Was this who she wanted to be? The woman who won every battle but lost every connection? The strategist who could outmaneuver anyone but couldn't remember the last time someone asked her how she was actually doing? She didn't have an answer, wasn't sure one existed. All she knew was that tomorrow would bring new battles, new people to outmaneuver, new threats to neutralize before they could touch her. Because that's what survivors did. They kept fighting, kept winning, kept building walls high enough to ensure nobody could hurt them the way they'd been hurt before, even if those walls eventually became indistinguishable from a prison. The clock struck midnight. The day officially ended. And in a manner that had witnessed 2 generations of Ashcombe family history, a woman who'd destroyed a duke to prove she existed stood alone in the darkness and wondered whether visibility was supposed to feel this much like disappearing. The invitation came from Parliament itself, delivered on official stationery with the Lord Chancellor's seal pressed into crimson wax. Evelyn held it in the morning light filtering through the breakfast room windows and felt something cold move through her chest. The Honourable Duchess of Ashcombe is cordially invited to provide testimony before the Parliamentary Committee on Wartime Financial Irregularities regarding matters pertaining to the investigation of Cedric Ashcombe, Duke of Ashcombe, and related allegations of treasonous correspondence. She read it 3 times to make sure she wasn't misunderstanding. They wanted her to testify, publicly, before Parliament, about the evidence she'd discovered, the timeline of events, her decision to report her husband's correspondence to authorities. Mrs. Hartwell arrived within the hour, summoned by urgent message. She read the invitation and her face went carefully blank in the way that meant she was thinking through implications faster than she could articulate them. "This is Ashford," she said finally. "Has to be. He's escalating." Evelyn set the invitation down with hands that wanted to shake but refused to give them permission. "How is forcing me to testify an escalation? I've already given statements to investigators. Everything I said is a matter of record." Mrs. Hartwell pulled out a chair and sat down without asking. "Because testimony before Parliament is public. Recorded. Open to cross-examination by people who will be trying to prove you orchestrated the entire scandal for personal reasons. Ashford's been building his case for months. The newspaper articles, the whisper campaigns, all of it designed to plant doubt about your motivations. Now he wants you on record, under oath, where he can tear apart your story in front of everyone who matters. They can't prove anything, Evelyn said. Her voice sounded more confident than she felt. The letters were real. The evidence was legitimate. What I felt about Cedric personally is irrelevant to whether he violated wartime regulations. Mrs. Hartwell's expression said she disagreed, but was trying to figure out how to phrase it diplomatically. They don't need to prove you fabricated evidence. They just need to prove you manipulated the timing and presentation of that evidence to maximize damage. That you turned a private marital dispute into a public scandal because you wanted revenge dressed up as patriotism. The moment you admit you knew about the letters for weeks before reporting them, the moment you acknowledge you leaked information to journalists first instead of going directly to authorities, they have you. Evelyn's hands clenched in her lap beneath the table where Mrs. Hartwell couldn't see them. So what do I do? Refuse to testify? You can't. It's a parliamentary summons. Refusing would be contempt and would make you look guilty of exactly what Ashford's been implying. Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward, her voice dropping. You have to go. You have to testify. And you have to be absolutely flawless. Because if you slip even once, if you give them any opening to question your credibility, they'll use it to destroy everything you've built. The weight of it settled over Evelyn like a physical thing. She'd spent 8 months constructing a narrative where she was the wounded patriot, the brave wife who'd chosen country over comfort. That narrative had become the foundation of her new life, the architecture supporting her reputation and independence. Now Ashford was going to force her to defend it under oath, while he and whoever he'd recruited to his cause tried to dismantle it piece by piece in front of London's entire political establishment. One mistake, one hesitation, one answer that contradicted her previous statements or revealed the rage that had actually motivated her actions. That's all it would take. When is the hearing? She asked. 3 weeks. Mrs. Hartwell's tone was grim. Which gives us time to prepare, but not much. We need to go through every statement you've ever made about the timeline, every interview you've given, every conversation that might have been overheard or recorded. Your testimony needs to be bulletproof. Then we make it bulletproof, Evelyn said with more conviction than she felt. They spent the next 3 weeks doing exactly that. Mrs. Hartwell brought in a former barrister named Thomas Whitmore, who specialized in parliamentary procedure. He drilled Evelyn relentlessly, asking variations of the same questions dozens of times, probing for inconsistencies or emotional reactions that could be exploited under cross-examination. When did you first discover the letters? How did you discover them? What was your immediate reaction? Why didn't you confront your husband directly? Why didn't you report them to authorities immediately? Who did you discuss this with before making the decision to report? Did you leak information to journalists? Did you coordinate the timing of revelations to maximize political damage? Over and over until Evelyn could recite her answers in her sleep. Until the story she'd constructed felt more real than the actual memory of kneeling on Cedric's study floor, reading letters that had made her want to set the entire manor on fire. The night before the hearing, she stood alone in her bedroom staring at the dress she'd chosen for tomorrow. Dark blue, almost severe. Professional. The outfit of a woman who took her civic duties seriously, who would never be so petty as to weaponize treason charges over a broken marriage. She wondered if Cedric would hear about the testimony, whether he was still in that small village teaching languages to children, or whether he'd moved on to some other anonymous life. Whether he would watch her defend the destruction of his entire existence and feel vindicated by his letter warning her that she was disappearing behind walls of warfare. The thought made her chest tight in a way she refused to examine too closely. Tomorrow would determine whether she survived with her reputation intact or whether Ashford managed to tear down everything she'd built. There was no middle ground, no compromise position. Either she convinced Parliament that she'd acted appropriately, or she became the vindictive wife who'd falsely destroyed a duke out of marital spite. She barely slept. The parliamentary chamber was packed when Evelyn arrived the next morning. Every seat in the public gallery filled with aristocrats and journalists who'd come to watch either her vindication or her humiliation. She could feel their eyes tracking her as she walked to the witness chair, feel the weight of collective judgment pressing down like atmosphere thickening before a storm. Lord Ashford sat in the front row of committee members, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes held something that looked like hunger barely contained behind professional courtesy. He'd been waiting months for this moment. The Lord Chancellor called the session to order and administered the oath. Evelyn placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, with a voice that didn't shake despite everything inside her screaming that this was a trap with no exit. The questioning began simply enough. Basic facts about her marriage to Cedric, the timeline of the war, her general awareness of his political activities. She answered carefully, precisely, giving nothing extra that could be twisted or reinterpreted later. Then they moved to the discovery of the letters. "Walk us through the evening you found this correspondence," the Lord Chancellor said. His tone was gentle, almost grandfatherly. "What prompted you to search your husband's study?" Evelyn had rehearsed this answer 100 times. "I'd noticed my husband had become increasingly distant and preoccupied. He made several trips to London that seemed inconsistent with parliamentary schedules. I was concerned about his well-being and whether he might be dealing with some personal crisis he wasn't sharing. So you violated his privacy out of wifely concern," Lord Ashford said. His first interjection, perfectly timed to sound reasonable rather than accusatory. "I looked in his study for some indication of what was troubling him," Evelyn corrected. "The study was in our shared home. I wasn't aware I needed permission to enter a room in my own residence." A few committee members nodded. Good. She'd landed that response exactly as Whitmore had coached her. "And what did you find?" the Lord Chancellor continued. Evelyn described the hidden compartment, the letters, the initial shock of discovery. She kept her tone measured, clinical, giving facts without emotion. A wife describing the worst moment of her marriage like she was reading a weather report. But the Lord Chancellor pressed deeper. "You stated in previous testimony that you read through all the letters that night. That must have taken considerable time, several hours at least." "Yes," Evelyn confirmed. "And during that time you didn't confront your husband? Didn't demand an explanation?" This was dangerous territory. The moment where her actual emotional state, rage, humiliation, the cold calculation of someone deciding to weaponize what she'd found, could leak through if she wasn't careful. "I was in shock," she said, and increasingly horrified as I realized the letters contained not just evidence of infidelity, but references to military intelligence and financial transfers during wartime. By the time I'd read enough to understand the scope of what I was looking at, my concern had shifted from personal betrayal to national security. It sounded good, plausible. The progression of a loyal citizen's priorities overriding a wife's wounded pride. Lord Ashford leaned forward. "And yet you didn't report your findings immediately. You returned the letters to their hiding place and said nothing for several days. Why?" Evelyn met his eyes directly. "I needed time to process what I'd discovered. To be certain, I wasn't misinterpreting private correspondence or letting personal feelings cloud my judgment about matters of national importance. I also needed to consult with people who could advise me on the proper authorities to approach." "Who did you consult?" Ashford asked. The question was sharp, precise, a blade sliding between ribs. This was it, the trap he'd been building toward. If she said she'd consulted no one, it made her look reckless and impulsive. If she named names, those people could be called to testify about what she'd actually said and whether it matched her current narrative. And if she admitted she'd discussed the letters with journalists before authorities, she'd be admitting to the exact manipulation Ashford had been accusing her of. Whitmore had coached her through this, the answer that admitted enough to seem honest while protecting her from the worst implications. "I spoke with Lady Pemberton," Evelyn said carefully. "Privately, about the general circumstances without revealing specific details. She advised me to consider the broader implications before taking any action that couldn't be reversed." "And did you speak with anyone else?" Ashford pressed. "Any journalists, perhaps?" "No." Evelyn's voice was firm. "I did not speak with journalists until after I'd reported the letters to appropriate authorities. It was technically true. She'd sent the anonymous letters, but she hadn't spoken to journalists directly until the scandal was already public. The distinction was razor thin, but it was there." Ashford studied her for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to push harder. Then he shifted tactics. "You've stated that your primary motivation in reporting your husband was patriotic duty. But isn't it true that your marriage was deeply unhappy? That you had multiple reasons to want to see your husband disgraced?" "My marriage was no more or less happy than many aristocratic marriages," Evelyn said. "We had our difficulties. But my personal feelings about my husband don't change the fact that he violated wartime regulations and shared sensitive information with a foreign national. So you're saying the timing of your discovery just happened to coincide with a period when your marriage was at its lowest point? That's merely coincidence? Evelyn felt anger flash hot behind her carefully maintained composure. I'm saying that what I felt about my husband personally became irrelevant the moment I realized he'd potentially endangered British soldiers for the sake of a romantic entanglement. Whether I was happy or miserable in my marriage doesn't change what he did. The chamber fell silent for a moment. She'd let too much emotion leak through. Ashford had gotten under her skin, and she'd reacted defensively instead of staying clinical. Whitmore had warned her about this, about letting Ashford provoke her into revealing the anger that actually motivated her actions. She took a breath and forced her expression back to neutral. The questioning continued for another 2 hours. They circled back to the timeline repeatedly, trying to catch her in contradictions or admissions that would undermine her credibility. Ashford hammered away at the delay between discovery and reporting, at her decision to file for divorce so quickly after the scandal broke, at the convenient timing of various revelations that had destroyed Cedric's reputation piece by piece. Evelyn held her ground, gave the answers she'd rehearsed, maintained the performance of wounded patriot rather than calculating destroyer. But she could feel the foundation shifting beneath her, could sense that Ashford had something else planned, some final strike he was building toward. It came during the last hour of testimony. Ashford stood and approached the witness chair with a document in his hand. Duchess Ashcombe, are you familiar with a woman named Catherine Mills? Evelyn's mind raced. The name meant nothing to her. I'm not, she said carefully. Ashford smiled. Miss Mills was a housemaid in your employ last year. She left service rather abruptly around the time of your husband's scandal. We've located her and taken a statement. Would you like to know what she told us? Evelyn's pulse hammered in her throat, but she kept her expression calm. I'm sure you're going to tell me regardless of whether I'd like to know. Ashford glanced at the document. Miss Mills states that approximately 2 weeks after you discovered the letters, before you reported them to any authorities, you had her deliver a sealed envelope to the offices of the London Chronicle. She didn't know what was in the envelope, but she remembers the timing clearly because you paid her a significant sum to ensure she didn't mention the errand to anyone else. The chamber erupted in whispers. The Lord Chancellor called for order. Evelyn felt ice flood her veins. She'd been so careful, had used different messengers, different locations for each leak, had never imagined that one of her own household staff would be tracked down and questioned months after the fact. Ashford pressed his advantage. We also have testimony from the Chronicle's editor stating that he received anonymous correspondence about your husband weeks before any official report was filed. Correspondence that contained details about the letters that only someone who'd read them personally could have known. He paused, letting the implications sink in. So, I'll ask you again, Duchess. Did you leak information to journalists before reporting your husband's correspondence to authorities? This was the moment. The trap fully sprung. If she admitted it now, she'd be confessing to exactly what Ashford had been accusing her of all along, that she'd orchestrated a public scandal to maximize damage rather than simply reporting a security breach through proper channels. But if she denied it in the face of witness testimony and editorial confirmation, she'd be committing perjury in front of Parliament. Either way, she was finished. The silence stretched. Every eye in the chamber locked on her, waiting. Evelyn's mind worked frantically through scenarios and consequences. She could admit to the leak but try to justify it as ensuring the matter received appropriate attention, could claim she'd been advised to create public pressure to guarantee proper investigation, could argue that wartime security concerns justified unusual measures. But even as she considered these defenses, she knew they were worthless. The performance she'd maintained for 8 months, the wounded wife who'd put country before personal feelings, was incompatible with the calculated leaking of information to destroy her husband's reputation before authorities even knew to investigate. She'd been caught, completely. Ashford had found the one piece of evidence that proved everything he'd been claiming about her motivations and methods. The Lord Chancellor cleared his throat. Duchess Ashcombe, you need to answer the question. Evelyn looked at Ashford and saw victory in his eyes. Saw him already planning his next political move, his next speech about exposing false patriots and malicious prosecution. And something inside her made a decision. Yes, she said clearly. I leaked information to the London Chronicle before reporting the letters to official authorities. The chamber exploded. The Lord Chancellor pounded his gavel, demanding order. Committee members erupted in arguments. Journalists in the gallery scribbled frantically. Through the chaos, Ashford stared at her with an expression that suggested he'd expected denial, expected her to commit perjury and give him grounds for criminal charges. Her admission had thrown his entire strategy into confusion. The Lord Chancellor finally restored order. Duchess Ashcombe, he said sternly, you understand you've just confessed to actions that completely undermine your previous testimony about your motivations and methods? Yes, Evelyn said. I understand that. Her voice was steady now, almost calm, because she'd just realized something that Ashford, in his eagerness to destroy her, had missed. She was already ruined. The moment he'd presented that evidence, her carefully constructed reputation as patriotic whistleblower was finished regardless of how she answered. Denial would have added perjury to her crimes. Admission simply confirmed what everyone would believe anyway, but admission also gave her one final chance to control the narrative, to define her own destruction rather than letting Ashford write the story. I leaked those letters before reporting them, she continued, because I knew how these things worked. I'd watched my husband and his colleagues bury inconvenient truths for years. I knew that if I went through proper channels quietly, there was a very real chance the matter would be investigated privately and resolved discreetly to protect the reputation of a powerful duke. So yes, I created public pressure first. I made sure the scandal was too visible to ignore or minimize. That's a confession to malicious prosecution, Ashford said. He sounded almost triumphant. You've just admitted you prioritized personal revenge over proper procedure. No, Evelyn said. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. I prioritized ensuring my husband faced actual consequences over protecting the reputation of someone who'd violated wartime security. You want to call that revenge? Fine. But the letters were real. The violations were real. The only thing I'm guilty of is understanding that power protects itself unless you force it into public view. She stood up before anyone could stop her, ignoring the Lord Chancellor's demands that she remain seated. You want to destroy me for exposing a duke who compromised national security? Go ahead. Strip my titles, confiscate my property, exile me from society. But you'll have to do it while admitting that the only thing worse than a woman who manipulates scandal is a system that would have protected a traitor if she'd followed proper channels. The chamber descended into complete chaos. Half the committee members shouting for her to be held in contempt, the other half arguing about whether she'd just made a point they couldn't ignore. Ashford on his feet demanding she be charged with perjury and malicious prosecution. Evelyn walked out before anyone could physically stop her, pushing through the crowd toward the exit. She could hear her name being shouted behind her, could feel the weight of dozens of witnesses watching her commit what amounted to professional suicide. But at least it was her choice this time. Her decision to go down fighting instead of being methodically dismantled by someone else's agenda. The cold air outside Parliament hit her like a slap. She stood on the steps trying to catch her breath while her mind raced through implications. She'd just destroyed herself more thoroughly than Ashford ever could have. Admitted to actions that would turn her from sympathetic figure into calculating manipulator, given every enemy she'd made during the past 8 months ammunition to tear her apart. Mrs. Hartwell appeared beside her within minutes, face pale with shock. "What did you do?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "What I had to," Evelyn said. She felt strangely calm, almost detached, like watching herself from a distance. He had me either way. At least this way I controlled how I went down. "They'll crucify you for this," Mrs. Hartwell said. Her voice carried something that might have been admiration mixed with horror. "Everything we built? Gone. Worse than gone. You've confirmed every accusation Ashford made." "I know," Evelyn said. They stood there in silence while around them London continued its endless churn of commerce and politics, oblivious to one woman's spectacular self-destruction on the steps of Parliament. Finally, Mrs. Hartwell spoke. "What do you want me to do?" Evelyn thought about it. About the manor that would probably be confiscated. About the reputation that had just been incinerated. About the life she'd built from the ashes of her marriage that was now burning down around her for the second time. "Help me get my affairs in order," she said. Whatever assets we can liquidate quickly, do it. I'll need money that isn't tied to properties they can seize, and I'll need it fast." "You're leaving," Mrs. Hartwell said, understanding dawning. "You're going to run before they can formally charge you." "What else is there?" Evelyn asked. "Stay and face trial for perjury and malicious prosecution? Watch them parade me through courts as an example of dangerous women who think they can weaponize scandal. I destroyed myself in there. I'm not going to give them the satisfaction of a public execution." Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly. "Then we need to move quickly. You have maybe 48 hours before warrants are issued." They spent the next 2 days in controlled frenzy. Mrs. Hartwell liquidated everything that could be sold quickly and quietly. Jewelry, investments, anything portable with value. She converted it all to bearer bonds and letters of credit that Evelyn could access from anywhere. Evelyn packed a single trunk, burned everything else that could be used as evidence or leverage. Every letter, every document, every trace of the woman she'd been for the past 8 months. On the morning of the 3rd day, before dawn broke over London, a hired carriage waited outside Ashcombe Manor's servants' entrance. Mrs. Hartwell handed over the financial documents with hands that shook slightly. "This should be enough to live comfortably for several years if you're careful. Longer if you're smart about investments." Evelyn took the envelope. "Thank you for everything." "Where will you go?" Mrs. Hartwell asked. Evelyn shook her head. "Better you don't know. When they question you, and they will, your ignorance will be genuine." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "For what it's worth, you were right. About Cedric, about Ashford, about all of it. You just made the mistake of being right while female in a system designed to punish that combination." The carriage driver coughed politely, signaling they needed to leave before the household staff started waking. Evelyn climbed into the carriage and looked back at the manor one last time. The house that had been both prison and fortress, the site of her greatest triumph and most complete destruction. Then the driver snapped the reins and they rolled away into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind everything Evelyn had fought for and won and lost in the span of 8 chaotic months. The crossing to France took 2 days. Evelyn spent most of it in her cabin, staring at walls and trying to process the magnitude of what she'd done. She'd gone from invisible wife to celebrated patriot to confessed manipulator in less than a year, had destroyed her husband, built a new identity, and then detonated that identity in front of Parliament rather than let Ashford control her destruction. And now she was fleeing England like a criminal, heading for the same country Cedric had been accused of betraying England to support. The irony was so brutal, it almost made her laugh. She arrived in Calais with no plan beyond disappearing, used a false name at the inn where she took a room, spent days reading English newspapers that arrived on delayed ships, watching her scandal play out in print. The coverage was vicious. Every paper had an opinion about the Duchess who lied. Editorial cartoons showed her as a serpent or harpy, destroying noble men for sport. The few defenders she'd had during the original scandal had abandoned her completely. Lady Pemberton issued a statement expressing deep disappointment and regret for having been deceived by false patriotism. Parliament formally charged her with perjury, malicious prosecution, and contempt. Warrants were issued. Her properties were seized pending trial. A reward was offered for information leading to her arrest. Evelyn read it all with a strange detachment, like watching someone else's life fall apart. On the 6th day in Calais, she received an unexpected visitor. The innkeeper knocked on her door looking uncomfortable. "There's a gentleman asking for you, madame. He says you'll want to see him." Evelyn's first thought was that she'd been found, that someone had recognized her and reported her location. She considered running, then realized she had nowhere to run to and no energy left to flee. "Send him up," she said. The man who entered her room was in his 50s, well-dressed, but not ostentatious. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone used to handling sensitive matters discreetly. "Duchess Ashcombe," he said, "or would you prefer a different name now?" "Who are you?" Evelyn asked. Her hand moved instinctively toward the letter opener on the writing desk. The man raised his hands peacefully. "My name is Thomas Brennan. I'm a solicitor based in Paris. I represent a client who wishes to speak with you about a matter of mutual interest." "I'm not interested in speaking with anyone," Evelyn said. "Whatever you're selling, I can't afford it." Brennan smiled slightly. I'm not selling anything. My client wishes to make you an offer, one I think you'll find worth considering given your current circumstances. Who's your client? Brennan pulled an envelope from his jacket and held it out. She asked me to give you this. Said you'd recognize the handwriting. Evelyn took the envelope with hands that had started shaking. She did recognize the handwriting, had seen it dozens of times in letters hidden beneath floorboards. Celeste Moreau. She broke the seal and read the single page inside. Evelyn, I imagine you're surprised to hear from me. I was equally surprised to learn you'd followed your former husband's path into French exile, though for dramatically different reasons. I've watched your story unfold from across the channel with considerable interest. The scandal, your rise, your spectacular fall. You've managed to accomplish something quite rare, making enemies of nearly everyone who matters in England while simultaneously proving you're far too intelligent to have done it accidentally. Which brings me to why I'm writing. I have a proposition for you. Nothing illegal or dangerous, I assure you. Simply an opportunity to use the skills you've clearly developed in strategic destruction for purposes that might prove more fulfilling than watching your life collapse in French seaside towns. If you're interested, my solicitor, Mr. Brennan, will bring you to Paris. If not, I'll ensure you're left alone to begin whatever new life you're planning. Either way, I thought you deserved to know that the woman whose letters destroyed your husband's life recognizes a kindred spirit when she sees one. C.M. Evelyn read the letter twice, then looked up at Brennan, who was waiting patiently by the door. What kind of proposition? She asked. Brennan's smile widened, the kind that requires a meeting in person. Madame Moreau is rather insistent on that point, and if I refuse, then I leave you in peace and we never speak of this again. Brennan's tone was perfectly neutral. Though I will say, having worked for Madame Moreau for nearly a decade, when she identifies someone with talent she finds valuable, the opportunities she offers tend to be worth at least hearing about. Evelyn looked at the letter again. At the handwriting that belonged to the woman who'd unwittingly provided the ammunition for Evelyn's revenge. The woman Cedric had loved long after she'd stopped wanting him. The ghost who'd haunted Evelyn's marriage without ever meaning to. And now that ghost was offering her something. What exactly, Evelyn had no idea. But sitting in this cramped room watching her English life die in delayed newspapers wasn't producing any better options. When would we leave? She asked. Brennan checked his pocket watch. There's a train in 3 hours. We could be in Paris by this evening. Evelyn stood and walked to the window. Outside, Calais stretched gray and unwelcoming beneath overcast skies. She'd fled here hoping for invisibility, for a chance to disappear into anonymity. But maybe invisibility wasn't the answer. Maybe it never had been. She'd spent 7 years invisible in her marriage, 8 months hypervisible as a weapon. Neither version had brought her anything except different flavors of emptiness. Perhaps it was time to become someone else entirely. Someone neither invisible nor weapon. Someone who'd learned from both identities without being consumed by either. She turned back to Brennan. Tell Madame Moreau I'll meet with her. Brennan nodded and moved toward the door. I'll arrange our departure. Pack light. Madame Moreau can provide anything you need in Paris. After he left, Evelyn sat down and reread Celeste's letter one more time. Kindred spirit, she'd written. Evelyn wasn't sure whether that was meant as compliment or warning, but as she packed her single trunk and prepared to follow a stranger to Paris, to meet the woman whose ghost had haunted her marriage and whose letters had provided the weapon for her revenge, she realized it didn't matter. She'd burned every bridge behind her, destroyed every identity she'd built, made enemies of everyone who'd once respected or feared her. All she had left was the brutal knowledge that she was good at destroying things, and the open question of whether those skills could be used for something besides self-immolation. Whatever Celeste Moreau was offering, it couldn't possibly be worse than sitting alone in exile watching the ashes of her English life scatter in the wind. The train left Calais station as afternoon faded into evening. Evelyn watched France roll past the window and tried not to think about what she was walking into. Tried not to wonder whether Cedric was still somewhere in this country, teaching children and pretending to be someone who'd never been a duke. Tried not to calculate whether accepting help from the woman who'd unwittingly destroyed her marriage was its own form of cosmic justice, or just the next chapter in her seemingly endless capacity for self-destruction. The train rattled through the countryside, carrying her toward Paris and whatever waited there. Toward a meeting with a woman she'd hated sight unseen for 7 years, without understanding that hatred was just another form of invisibility. And somewhere in the rhythm of wheels on track and the darkness gathering outside the window, Evelyn Ashcombe felt the last traces of the woman she'd been dissolve completely. The Duchess was dead. The Patriot was dead. The strategist who'd thought she could win her way to wholeness was dead. What remained was someone stripped bare of every identity except the fundamental truth she'd been running from since the night she found those letters. She was good at destruction, brilliant at it, but she'd never learned how to build anything that wasn't just a prettier version of a cage. The train carried her into darkness, into uncertainty, into whatever transformation waited in Paris. And for the first time since her wedding day 8 years ago, Evelyn had absolutely no idea who she was going to become next. Paris at night was a different animal than London, where London's elite gathered in drawing rooms to whisper poison into champagne flutes. Paris conducted its warfare in cafes and salons, where smoke and wine loosened tongues that would have stayed careful in daylight. Evelyn watched the city pass through the carriage window as Brennan drove her through streets that smelled like roasted chestnuts and something darker she couldn't name. They stopped in front of a townhouse in the Marais district, elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of place that announced its owner had money without needing to prove it through excess. Brennan led her through an entrance hall lined with paintings that looked expensive enough to ransom a minor royal, up a staircase where candlelight caught on gilt frames and Persian runners, and finally to a sitting room where a woman stood silhouetted against floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a private garden. Celeste Moreau turned as they entered, and Evelyn felt something cold slide down her spine. She'd spent 7 years imagining this woman, building her into a phantom of beauty and sophistication, the kind of perfect romantic ideal that justified Cedric's inability to love his actual wife. The reality was simultaneously more mundane and more dangerous than any fantasy Evelyn had constructed. Celeste was perhaps 40, dark-haired with gray threading through it like silver wire, dressed in a way that suggested she'd stopped caring about fashion sometime around the same moment she'd stopped caring what men thought of her. She had the look of someone who'd survived things that should have killed her and had emerged from the wreckage with all her softness burned away, leaving only the hard angles underneath. "Duchess Ashcombe," Celeste said. Her English carried a French accent but was otherwise flawless. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. I imagine this is awkward." "That's one word for it," Evelyn said. She stood just inside the doorway, every muscle tense like she was preparing to run or fight and hadn't decided which yet. "You're the woman whose letters destroyed my life. Twice now, technically." Celeste's mouth curved slightly. Not a smile exactly, more like acknowledgement of a point well made. "Would you like something to drink?" "I find these conversations go better with alcohol." "Whiskey, if you have it," Evelyn said. She wasn't sure what game was being played here, but she was tired of pretending she wasn't exhausted and desperate and running out of options. Celeste poured 2 generous glasses from a crystal decanter and handed one to Evelyn. Brennan had vanished at some point, leaving them alone in a room that suddenly felt much smaller than its actual dimensions. They drank in silence for a moment, studying each other like generals assessing terrain before battle. Finally, Celeste spoke. "I want to start by saying I never intended for any of what happened to you. The letters were private correspondence I tried repeatedly to end. I had no idea Cedric was keeping them or that they contained anything that could be weaponized the way you used them." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "I didn't weaponize them. I reported violations of wartime security regulations." "Please," Celeste said. The word was gentle but carried steel underneath. "We're alone now. No parliament, no journalists, no one performing for anyone else's benefit. You destroyed your husband because he humiliated you, and you had the means to do it. I'm not judging you for that. I'm simply asking that we start this conversation from a place of honesty about who we actually are, rather than who we pretend to be for public consumption." The directness of it caught Evelyn off guard. She'd spent 8 months navigating London society where everyone lied as a matter of course, where truth was currency spent only when absolutely necessary. Celeste's bluntness felt like someone had opened a window in a room that had been slowly suffocating her. Fine, Evelyn said. I destroyed him because he made me feel worthless, and I wanted him to suffer. Happy? Celeste nodded. Much better. Now we can actually talk. She settled into a chair and gestured for Evelyn to do the same. When Evelyn remained standing near the door, Celeste shrugged and continued. I have a business, she said. Nothing illegal, before your mind goes there. I broker information. Connect people who need things with people who can provide them. Sometimes that's political intelligence, sometimes financial, sometimes simply the right introduction at the right moment. I've built a network across Europe over the past decade that makes me valuable to a very specific kind of client. Evelyn felt her pulse quicken. You're a spy. I prefer information broker, Celeste said. Spy suggests I work for a government. I work for myself and occasionally for people who pay well enough to be worth the risk. And before you ask, no, I never gave Cedric's letters to French intelligence. Your husband was feeding me information I already had from better sources. His correspondence was purely personal on my end, though I suspect on his end it felt like patriotic risk-taking. Then why contact me now? Evelyn asked. What do you want? Celeste took a long sip of whiskey. I want to offer you employment. You've demonstrated a remarkable talent for strategic destruction and manipulation of public narrative. Those are skills I can use. Specifically, I have clients who occasionally need someone with your particular combination of ruthlessness and social credibility to handle situations that require a delicate touch, backed by a willingness to burn things down if necessary. You want to hire me to destroy people for money? Evelyn said flatly. I want to hire you to solve problems using whatever methods prove necessary, Celeste corrected. Sometimes that's destruction. Sometimes it's more subtle. But yes, fundamentally, I'm asking whether you'd like to get paid for doing what you're apparently quite good at, instead of doing it for free and having it destroy your life. Evelyn stared at her, at the woman who'd haunted her marriage without knowing it, who was now calmly proposing that Evelyn become a professional version of the monster she'd accidentally become through rage and desperation. Part of her wanted to throw the whiskey in Celeste's face and walk out, to cling to whatever remained of her dignity and refuse to become the mercenary this woman was describing. But another part, the part that had spent the past week watching her life collapse in newspaper accounts while she hid in French port towns, recognized that Celeste was offering something Evelyn had lost the moment she walked out of Parliament. A purpose. A use for skills she'd discovered she possessed. A way forward that wasn't just quiet exile and slow decay into obscurity. What kind of problems? Evelyn asked. Celeste's expression suggested she'd been waiting for that question and knew it meant Evelyn was already halfway to saying yes. Right now I have a client in Vienna who needs to discredit a business rival without it being traced back to them. I have another in Brussels who's being blackmailed and needs the blackmailer neutralized in a way that doesn't involve violence. I have a third who needs entry into a social circle that's currently closed to them and requires someone who understands how to manufacture the right introductions. And you think I can do these things? Evelyn said. I think you destroyed one of England's most powerful dukes using nothing but his own correspondence and a sophisticated understanding of how scandal spreads through elite circles, Celeste said. I think you then nearly survived being destroyed yourself through pure strategic instinct. You made mistakes at the end, let Ashford provoke you into tactical errors, but you're still alive and free when, by all rights, you should be in an English prison awaiting trial. That suggests to me you have both the skills I need and the survival instinct to avoid getting killed or captured while deploying them. Evelyn drained her whiskey and held out the glass for more. Celeste poured without comment. What's the pay? Evelyn asked. Depends on the assignment, Celeste said. The Vienna job would net you enough to live comfortably for 6 months. The Brussels situation is more complex and pays accordingly. You wouldn't be wealthy, but you'd never worry about money again if you're good at this work. And based on what I've seen, you'll be very good at it. Evelyn walked to the windows and looked out at the garden below. Somewhere in London, warrants still carried her name. Somewhere in England, people were still discussing the Duchess who lied over dinner parties and newspaper editorials. Her entire life before this moment was ash and scandal. She could refuse Celeste's offer, could take the money Mrs. Hartwell had liquidated and disappear into some quiet corner of Europe where no one knew her name or story, could spend the rest of her life being nobody in particular, which was a different kind of invisibility than what she'd endured in her marriage, but invisibility nonetheless. Or she could become exactly what Ashford and all her other enemies had accused her of being. could lean into the role of strategic manipulator and turn it into something that put food on her table and kept her skills sharp and gave her a reason to wake up in the morning beyond avoiding capture. When she turned back to Celeste, her decision was already made. She could see it reflected in the other woman's face before she even spoke. "When do I start?" Evelyn asked. Celeste smiled. A real smile this time, not the careful approximation from before. "Tomorrow, if you're ready, we'll begin with something simple to get you acclimated. Consider it training." "And if I fail?" "Then you fail," Celeste said with a shrug. "I'll pay you a reduced rate for the attempt and we'll evaluate whether this arrangement has potential. But something tells me failure isn't something you're particularly familiar with, Duchess." The title landed with irony, sharp enough to cut. Evelyn wasn't a duchess anymore. Wasn't anything recognizable by the standards of the world she'd come from. Maybe that was the point. Maybe she'd needed to lose everything before she could figure out what she actually was beneath all the roles and performances. She raised her glass. To new beginnings, then. Celeste clinked her glass against Evelyn's. To discovering whether destruction can be a profession instead of just a coping mechanism. They drank to that. Two women who'd been connected by accident through a man neither of them had particularly wanted, now bound together by mutual recognition that they'd both survived things that should have killed them and had emerged from the wreckage as something harder and more dangerous than they'd been before. Evelyn had come to Paris expecting nothing except continued exile. She was leaving with a job that would either give her life new purpose or destroy her even more thoroughly than she'd managed to destroy herself. Either way, at least she wouldn't be invisible. The Vienna assignment came 3 days later after Celeste had spent 72 hours testing Evelyn's ability to gather intelligence, read people's vulnerabilities, and construct narratives that would spread through social networks without obvious origin points. Evelyn passed every test with a ruthlessness that seemed to genuinely impress Celeste, who'd clearly expected competence but not the level of strategic instinct Evelyn demonstrated when given actual targets to analyze. The mark was a banker named Klaus Richter, who'd built his fortune through predatory lending practices that kept smaller merchants perpetually indebted while he consolidated their assets. Evelyn's client was a textile merchant whose entire business had been consumed by Richter's operation. The merchant wanted revenge but couldn't afford direct confrontation with someone who had Vienna's financial elite protecting him. "Your job is to crack his reputation without it being traced back to our client," Celeste explained during the briefing. Richter's built his entire identity on being a pillar of Viennese society. Find the fault line and exploit it. Evelyn spent 2 weeks in Vienna, embedding herself in the same social circles Richter frequented. She used a false name and a cover story about being a French widow with inherited wealth looking to invest in Austrian business opportunities. The story got her invitations to the right parties and introductions to the right people. Richter himself was exactly what she'd expected. Mid-50s, corpulent with self-satisfaction, the kind of man who measured his worth in how many people owed him money. He approached her at a gallery opening with the predatory confidence of someone who'd never been rejected by a woman who needed capital. Evelyn let him pursue her, played the role of intrigued investor with just enough naivety to make him think he could manipulate her into a bad deal. Let him buy her expensive dinners and attend her at social events where his presence gave her access to even more of Vienna's financial elite. And while he was busy trying to seduce her money, she was busy gathering information about his actual vulnerabilities. It took 3 weeks to find the opening she needed. Richter had a mistress tucked away in an apartment he paid for through a shell company. Nothing scandalous by itself, half of Vienna's married men had similar arrangements. But the mistress was the daughter of a rabbi who'd lost his synagogue to one of Richter's foreclosures. The girl had been barely 16 when Richter started the affair. The story had everything: financial predation, sexual impropriety, the exploitation of a religious community he'd driven into bankruptcy. It just needed to reach the right ears in the right way. Evelyn spent another week carefully positioning the information. She didn't leak it directly. That would have been traceable. Instead, she arranged for the mistress to be seen in public with Richter in a way that would spark curiosity. Then she made sure the right people started asking questions about who the girl was and why Richter was spending so much time with her. The questions led to investigation. Investigation led to someone discovering the girl's father was the bankrupt rabbi. That discovery led to outrage in Vienna's Jewish community, and questions about whether Richter had used his leverage over the foreclosure to pressure the girl into the affair. Within 2 weeks of Evelyn's strategic placement of breadcrumbs, Richter was facing social exile, potential criminal charges, and the complete collapse of his reputation. His business partners started distancing themselves. His wife filed for separation. The banks that had protected him suddenly discovered they needed to review his operations with much greater scrutiny. Evelyn watched it all unfold from a cafe across from Richter's office, drinking coffee and feeling the same cold satisfaction she'd felt watching Cedric's world collapse. She'd done this, built the architecture of someone else's destruction with nothing but strategic information placement and an understanding of how scandal moves through elite communities. The difference was, this time she was getting paid for it, and the target had actually deserved what happened to him. She returned to Paris to find Celeste waiting with another assignment and a bank draft for more money than Evelyn had seen since fleeing England. "Well done," Celeste said. "That was cleaner than I expected from someone on their first professional job. How did it feel?" Evelyn considered the question honestly, like being good at something I wish I didn't enjoy as much as I do. Celeste nodded like that was exactly the answer she'd been hoping for. "Welcome to the profession, Duchess. You're going to do very well at this." Over the next 6 months, Evelyn took on 5 more assignments. Each one refined her skills, taught her new techniques, showed her the difference between rage-fueled destruction and calculated professional manipulation. She learned to separate her emotions from her targets, to view each assignment as a puzzle to be solved rather than a person to be destroyed out of personal vendetta. She was good at it, terrifyingly good. The kind of natural talent that comes from having spent years observing power dynamics from the sidelines and then discovering you have both the instinct and the ruthlessness to exploit them. But something was wrong. Something she couldn't name had started eating at her during quiet moments between assignments. A hollow feeling that success in this profession wasn't filling the same way she'd hoped it would. She was making money, building a reputation in Celeste's network as someone who could handle complex situations with discretion and efficiency, proving she could survive and even thrive in this strange underworld of information brokers and strategic warfare. But she was also alone. More alone than she'd been even in the worst days of her marriage, because at least then she'd had the hope that things might change. Now she knew better, knew that this was what she was, a professional destroyer of reputations and lives, someone people hired when they needed something broken and didn't want to get their own hands dirty. The realization that she'd simply traded one form of emptiness for another hit her during an assignment in Rome. She'd just finished destroying a corrupt magistrate's career and was walking back to her hotel when she passed a family sitting at a cafe. Parents and 2 children laughing over dinner like the world wasn't a battlefield where everyone was trying to survive by tearing each other down. She'd looked at them and felt nothing but distance, like she was watching a play about people whose lives were so foreign to her own experience they might as well have been speaking a different language. When had she become this? Not just professionally dangerous, but fundamentally disconnected from anything resembling normal human emotion. She was still wrestling with that question when she returned to Paris and Celeste handed her an assignment that would change everything. "There's a situation in London," Celeste said. Her tone was careful, in a way that suggested she knew this would be complicated. "A client needs someone discredited before they can testify in an upcoming parliamentary investigation. The target is politically connected, and the timeline is tight." "London," Evelyn said. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. She'd spent 6 months successfully avoiding anything that would bring her within 100 miles of England. "You know I can't go back there. There are still warrants." "Not under your own name," Celeste said. "We'd create a new identity, full documentation, background story that would hold up under scrutiny. You'd be a different person entirely." "Who's the target?" Evelyn asked. Celeste hesitated. That's the complicated part. She handed over a file. Evelyn opened it and felt the world tilt sideways. The photograph showed Lord Ashford, the man who'd destroyed her testimony and driven her out of England, the man who'd been building a career on his reputation as the parliamentarian who'd exposed false patriotism and malicious prosecution. "Your client wants me to destroy Ashford," Evelyn said slowly. "Not destroy," Celeste corrected. "Simply discredit enough that his testimony in the upcoming investigation won't carry weight. He's set to be a key witness in a corruption case involving military supply contracts. Our client has a vested interest in making sure Ashford's credibility is questioned before he takes the stand. Who's the client? Evelyn demanded. You know I can't tell you that, Celeste said, but I will tell you the pay is triple your usual rate. Enough to set you up for years if you invest it properly. And more importantly, it gives you a chance to even the score with the man who destroyed your life in England. Evelyn stared at Ashford's photograph, at the face of the man who'd methodically dismantled her reputation and forced her into exile, who'd taken satisfaction in exposing her manipulations and driving her out of the only country she'd ever known. The smart move was to refuse. Going back to London, even under a false identity, was dangerous. If anyone recognized her, if the identity didn't hold up, she'd be arrested immediately and face trial for perjury and a dozen other charges. But the chance to destroy Ashford, the way he destroyed her, was almost too perfect to resist. The symmetry of it appealed to something dark in her that she'd been trying to pretend didn't exist. She looked up at Celeste. If I do this and it goes wrong, you won't be able to protect me. I'll be on my own in a country that wants me imprisoned. Yes, Celeste said simply. This is high risk. I won't pretend otherwise. But the payoff is substantial, and you're the only person I trust to pull it off. Evelyn walked to the window and stared out at Paris at twilight. She'd built a life here. Not a good life exactly, but a functional one. She had money, work that kept her mind occupied, a profession she was good at even if it made her feel increasingly hollow inside. Going back to London meant risking all of that for revenge against someone who'd simply done to her what she'd done to Cedric. Ashford had exposed her manipulations because they were manipulation-worthy, had driven her into exile because she'd earned it through her own choices. Was destroying him justice, or just the continuation of a cycle she'd started and couldn't seem to break? She thought about Cedric's letter, warning her that she was becoming invisible behind walls of strategic warfare. Thought about standing in that Vienna cafe watching a family laugh together and feeling nothing but distance. Thought about the woman she'd been 8 years ago, young and stupid enough to believe duty might transform into affection. That woman was dead. Killed by 7 years of invisibility, followed by 8 months of warfare, followed by 6 months of professional destruction. What remained was someone who'd forgotten how to be anything except dangerous. Maybe destroying Ashford wouldn't change that. Maybe nothing would. But at least it would feel like completing something, like closing a circle that had been broken open the night she found those letters and decided rage was stronger than dignity. She turned back to Celeste. I'll do it. But I want full autonomy on strategy and I want evacuation protocols in place if things go sideways. I'm not getting caught because you or your client got careless with operational security. Celeste nodded. Agreed. When can you leave? Give me 48 hours to prepare, Evelyn said. Then book passage to London under whatever identity you've created. And Celeste? I need everything you have on Ashford. Financial records, political connections, personal relationships, anything that might reveal a vulnerability. I'm not going in blind. Celeste smiled. I'll have a full dossier ready by morning. That night, Evelyn lay awake in her Paris apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince herself she wasn't making a catastrophic mistake. She was going back to England under a false name to destroy the man who'd exposed her lies, funded by a client whose identity she didn't know. Trusting that forged documents and a good cover story would keep her from being arrested the moment someone looked at her too closely. It was insane. Reckless. The kind of decision someone made when they'd stopped caring whether they survived as long as they took their enemy down with them. But she'd already committed. Already told Celeste yes. Already started planning the architecture of Ashford's destruction in her head. Because if she was going to be the monster everyone believed she was, she might as well be a thorough one. The next morning, she began reviewing the dossier Celeste provided. 200 pages of documentation about Lord Ashford's life, carefully compiled by information brokers who'd been watching him for months in preparation for this assignment. Evelyn absorbed it all. His financial interest, his political alliances, his family connections, his wife who spent most of her time at their country estate while he maintained apartments in London. His mistress, who everyone knew about but nobody discussed publicly because that was how things worked among people of his class. And buried on page 73, the vulnerability she'd been looking for. Ashford had a brother, younger by 8 years, less successful, perpetually in debt, and perpetually bailed out by his elder siblings' money and connections. The brother had gambling debts, bad business investments, a weakness for expensive living he couldn't actually afford. More importantly, the brother had recently been implicated in a scheme involving fraudulent military contracts. Nothing proven yet, still under investigation, but the smoke was thick enough that someone would eventually find fire. If Evelyn could prove Ashford had known about his brother's fraud and had used his political position to cover it up, she could destroy him the same way he'd destroyed her. Not through attacking him directly, but through exposing the contradiction between his public righteousness and his private protection of corruption. The irony was perfect. Ashford had built his recent political rise on exposing false patriotism. Now she would expose him as someone who'd protected actual fraud while preaching integrity. She spent the next 36 hours memorizing every detail of her new identity. Margaret Sutton, widow of a minor French nobleman, recently returned to England after years abroad, interested in investing in London business opportunities. The documentation was flawless. Birth records, marriage certificate, death certificate for her fictional husband, financial records showing she had moderate wealth from inheritance. Celeste's people had thought of everything, down to coaching Evelyn on the accent and mannerisms that would make Margaret Sutton feel like a real person rather than a hastily constructed fiction. On the morning of the third day, Evelyn boarded a ship bound for Dover dressed in clothes that Margaret Sutton would wear, carrying papers that established Margaret Sutton's entire existence, preparing to walk back into the country that wanted her imprisoned and destroy the man who'd driven her out. The crossing was rough. Gray seas under grayer skies, the kind of weather that matched her mood perfectly. She spent most of it on deck letting rain lash her face and trying to remember who Evelyn Ashcombe had been before she'd learned that invisibility hurt less than visibility as a weapon. She couldn't remember anymore. That woman felt like someone she'd read about in a novel years ago, a character whose choices had seemed comprehensible at the time, but now looked like the decisions of a stranger. When the white cliffs of Dover appeared through the mist, Evelyn felt something twist in her chest. Not quite fear, not quite anticipation. Something darker and more complicated that tasted like coming home to a house you'd burned down and hoping the ruins still held something worth salvaging. The customs inspection was brief and bored. Her papers passed without question. Margaret Sutton was admitted to England without incident, while somewhere in government files Evelyn Ashcombe remained a wanted fugitive. She took a carriage to London and checked into a hotel under her false name. Spent the evening reviewing Ashford's schedule and planning her approach. She couldn't be seen anywhere near him directly, too risky. But she could position herself in the same social circles, the same business networks, the same spaces where information flowed and reputations were built or destroyed. The next morning, she began executing the plan she'd constructed during the crossing. First step was gaining entry to the financial district where Ashford's brother conducted his increasingly desperate business. She presented herself as an investor interested in shipping ventures. Let it be known she had capital available for the right opportunities. Within 3 days, Ashford's brother approached her himself. Desperate men always found money eventually, and she'd made sure to seem both wealthy enough to be worth pursuing and naive enough to be exploited. His pitch was predictably awful. A shipping venture that existed mostly on paper, backed by contracts that wouldn't survive even cursory legal review. Evelyn played the interested widow, asked questions that made her seem thoughtful without being dangerously perceptive. And during those meetings, she gathered exactly what she needed. Documents, names, dates of transactions that connected the brother to the fraudulent military contracts. Evidence that Lord Ashford had intervened on his brother's behalf with parliamentary officials. Proof that the man who'd exposed false patriotism was protecting actual corruption when it benefited his family. It took 2 weeks to assemble everything she needed. 2 weeks of careful maneuvering, strategic questions, and the kind of patient information gathering that left no obvious trail back to her. She was better at this now than she'd been when destroying Cedric. More controlled, more professional. Also more hollow inside. But she was getting used to that. When she finally had enough evidence to be devastating, she handed it off to Celeste's contact in London, who would leak it to the right journalists at the right time. The pattern would be familiar to anyone who'd watched Evelyn's original takedown of her husband. Strategic revelations that built on each other, creating a narrative too consistent to dismiss as isolated coincidence. Within 48 hours of the first leak, London's papers were running stories about Lord Ashford's questionable protection of his brother's business interests. Within 72 hours, parliamentary committees were demanding investigations. Within a week, Ashford's upcoming testimony in the military corruption case was being questioned as potentially compromised by his own family's involvement in similar schemes. Evelyn watched it unfold from her hotel room, reading newspaper accounts and tracking the destruction of Ashford's reputation with the same cold efficiency she'd brought to every other assignment. She'd done it, destroyed the man who'd destroyed her, proven she could return to England under a false identity, and take down one of Parliament's most prominent members without being caught. The victory should have felt triumphant. Instead, it just felt like confirmation that destruction was the only thing she was actually good at, and that every time she used that skill, she lost another piece of whatever humanity she'd possessed before this all started. She was packing to leave London when the knock came on her hotel room door. For a moment, she considered running, going out the window and hoping she could disappear into London streets before whoever was outside forced entry. But something in the quality of the knock, polite, patient, not the sound of someone about to arrest her, made her walk to the door and open it carefully. Cedric stood in the hallway. She nearly closed the door in his face, nearly screamed, nearly broke every rule of operational security by reacting in a way that would have drawn attention from other hotel guests. Instead, she grabbed his arm, pulled him inside, and closed the door with hands that shook so badly she could barely turn the lock. "What the hell are you doing here?" she demanded. Her voice came out half-strangled. "How did you even find me?" Cedric looked older than when she'd last seen him, thinner. There was gray threading through his hair now and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, but his gaze was steady and held something she couldn't identify. "I've been watching the news about Ashford," he said quietly, "watching the pattern of revelations, the strategic timing, the way each piece of information built on the last to create maximum damage. And I recognized it. Recognized you. So I started asking questions, calling in favors from people who still owed me things despite everything. Eventually, I found someone who'd seen a woman matching your description in the financial district asking questions about shipping ventures. It wasn't hard to track you here once I knew what I was looking for." Evelyn felt ice flood her system. If Cedric had found her, others could too. Anyone watching closely enough could connect the pattern of Ashford's destruction to her methods and start looking for someone matching her description operating under a false identity. "You need to leave," she said. "You can't be here. If anyone sees us together—" Cedric cut her off. "I'm not here to turn you in or expose you. I'm here because you're about to make a mistake that will destroy what's left of you, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least try to stop it." Evelyn stared at him. At the man whose life she'd dismantled, who'd been driven into exile, who had every reason to want to see her arrested and imprisoned. And he was standing in her hotel room talking about protecting her from herself. "What mistake?" she asked. Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Thinking this will ever be enough," Cedric said. "Thinking if you destroy enough people who've wronged you, eventually you'll feel whole again." "I know because I spent 7 years making that same mistake with those letters to Celeste. Kept writing to a woman who didn't want me because it felt like mourning something beautiful instead of facing the reality that my actual life was lonely, and I'd chosen that loneliness through my own cowardice." "I'm not you," Evelyn said. "No," Cedric agreed. "You're worse, because you're better at destruction than I ever was, and you're going to keep using that skill until there's nothing left of the person you used to be. You've already disappeared, Evelyn. The woman I married, the woman who might have been someone whole if I'd bothered to see her, she's gone. What's left is just a weapon that other people point at their enemies." "Get out," Evelyn said. Her hands were shaking again, and her vision was blurring, and she could feel something cracking inside her that she couldn't afford to let break. "Not until you hear me," Cedric said. He took a step forward, and she backed away instinctively. "I loved you. Did you know that? Somewhere in the last year of our marriage, I'd finally started to see you. Started to understand what I'd been ignoring. And by then you already hated me so completely, there was no path back to anything resembling partnership. So I kept writing to Celeste because fantasy was easier than facing what I'd destroyed through negligence." Evelyn's back hit the wall. "Stop. You destroyed me because I made you invisible," Cedric continued. His voice was gentle but relentless. And then you became something even more invisible. A professional ghost who destroys people's lives and disappears before anyone can see who you actually are. You think that's better than what we had? You think being dangerous is the same as being whole? The words hit like physical blows. Evelyn felt herself sliding down the wall until she was sitting on the floor with her knees pulled to her chest, breathing too fast, something inside her fracturing in a way that felt catastrophic and overdue. Cedric knelt in front of her. His hand reached out like he might touch her shoulder, then pulled back. "Come with me," he said quietly. "Leave this. Leave Celeste and her assignments and this profession that's eating you alive. We'll go somewhere no one knows either of us. Start over as different people. I'm not saying we could fix what we were. I'm saying maybe we could figure out who we are now, after everything." Evelyn looked up at him through tears she didn't remember starting to cry. "You're insane. We destroyed each other. Why would I go anywhere with you?" "Because we're the only two people who actually understand what this cost," Cedric said. "Everyone else sees the scandal, or the strategy. We're the only ones who know what it felt like to be the people underneath all that before we set everything on fire." The hotel room was silent except for Evelyn's ragged breathing and the distant sound of London traffic below. She was sitting on the floor of a hotel room under a false name, having just destroyed another person's life for money, being offered escape by the man whose destruction had started this entire spiral into professional monstrosity. The smart move was to refuse, to send Cedric away, complete her extraction from London, return to Paris, and continue being whatever she'd become. But sitting there on that floor with her carefully constructed defenses shattered around her, Evelyn couldn't remember why being smart had ever seemed more important than being human. "I don't know if there's anything left to save," she whispered. "Then let's find out," Cedric said. "Together. Because separately we're both just ghosts haunting the ruins of who we used to be." Outside the window, London was waking to news of Lord Ashford's scandal. Somewhere in Paris, Celeste was probably already planning the next assignment. Somewhere in England's legal system, warrants still carried Evelyn's name. And in a hotel room under a false identity, two people who destroyed each other were staring across the wreckage, wondering if reconstruction was even possible or if they'd both burned too hot and too long to ever be anything except ash. Evelyn closed her eyes and tried to remember what hope felt like. Couldn't find it, but maybe exhaustion was close enough to start with. "I'll go," she said finally, "but I can't promise this ends anywhere except more destruction." Cedric's hand finally closed around hers. "Neither can I, but at least it won't be lonely destruction." They sat there on the floor as morning light crept through the windows. Two people who'd learned the hard way that winning wars against each other just meant they both lost everything, preparing to walk away from the battlefield before it consumed whatever fragments of themselves still remained. They left London before dawn, two ghosts slipping through streets still dark enough to hide faces from anyone who might recognize them. Cedric had arranged passage on a merchant vessel heading to Portugal, the kind of ship that asked no questions as long as payment arrived in advance and passengers kept to themselves. Evelyn walked beside him through the docks wearing clothes that belonged to Margaret Sutton, but feeling like someone who'd shed even that false skin and was now just raw nerve endings wrapped in fabric. The crossing took 4 days. They spoke little during that time, existing in adjacent silence that felt less like companionship and more like two survivors of the same catastrophe trying to remember how humans communicated when they weren't destroying each other. Evelyn spent most of the voyage on deck watching gray water stretch endlessly in all directions and wondering whether redemption was actually possible or if they were just delaying the inevitable moment when they'd realize some damage couldn't be undone. Cedric found her there the night before they reached Lisbon. He stood at the railing a few feet away, close enough to constitute presence, but distant enough to offer escape if she needed it. The wind carried salt and the promise of landfall, scents that should have felt like hope, but mostly just smelled like change. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said without looking at her. "After we reach Portugal, what we actually do with whatever time we have left." Evelyn kept her eyes on the horizon. "We disappear. Find some village where no one knows our names or stories. Live quietly until we die or get caught, or whatever ending people like us deserve." "Is that what you want?" Cedric asked. "Quiet obscurity? After everything you've learned about what you're capable of?" The question hit harder than it should have, because the truth was Evelyn didn't know what she wanted anymore. For 7 years she'd wanted to be seen. For 8 months she'd wanted revenge. For 6 months, she'd wanted professional competence and the satisfaction of being good at something, even if that something was destroying people's lives. Now she just wanted to feel human again, to remember what it was like to care about something beyond the next target or the next strategic maneuver. But she didn't know if that was actually possible or if she'd burned away the parts of herself that could still feel anything except empty victory. "I want to stop being this," she said finally. Her voice came out quieter than intended. "I want to wake up one morning and not immediately start calculating angles and vulnerabilities. I want to look at another person without automatically assessing how I could destroy them if necessary. I want to be someone who doesn't terrify herself every time she looks in a mirror." Cedric turned toward her then. His expression was complicated in the moonlight, something between understanding and his own mirror of that same exhaustion. "I spent 2 years in that village teaching children," he said. 2 years pretending to be someone simple who'd never held power or destroyed lives through negligence and cowardice. And you know what I learned? You can't actually become a different person just by changing locations. The man I was, the Duke who ignored his wife and compromised national security for a fantasy relationship, that person came with me, sat beside me during lessons, whispered in my ear at night that I was just playing at redemption without actually earning it. "Then why did you stay?" Evelyn asked. "Why not come back to England, try to rebuild your life there?" "Because rebuilding would have meant becoming exactly who I was before, just with a damaged reputation," Cedric said. "It would have meant sliding back into the same patterns, the same political games, the same fundamental disconnect between the person I wanted to be and the person I actually was. At least in exile, I could face what I'd lost without the distraction of trying to reclaim it." Evelyn absorbed this. The waves beneath them made rhythmic sounds like breathing, like the ocean itself was trying to teach them something about the difference between drowning and floating. "So what are we actually doing?" she asked. "If we can't become different people and we can't go back to who we were, what's left?" Cedric was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he said, "Maybe we learn to be people who did terrible things and have to live with that. Not people who pretend it didn't happen or people who let it define everything. Just people who fucked up catastrophically and are trying to figure out what comes after catastrophe." It wasn't an answer exactly, more like a direction, a suggestion that redemption might be less about transformation and more about acceptance of the specific ways they'd each broken themselves and each other. The ship rolled with a wave. Evelyn's hand shot out to grip the railing and found Cedric's hand already there. Their fingers overlapped by accident and neither of them moved to adjust the contact. They stood like that until dawn started threatening the eastern sky. Two people who'd destroyed everything they'd ever touched, trying to believe that maybe destruction wasn't the only thing they were capable of, even if it was the thing they were best at. Portugal was brown hills and white buildings baking under sun that felt like absolution after London's perpetual gray. They took rooms in a coastal town small enough that strangers were noteworthy, but large enough that two more wouldn't draw sustained attention. Cedric rented a small house on the edge of town, using money he'd saved during his exile in France. Evelyn contributed half from the payment for the Ashford job, her last act of professional destruction, funding her attempt at becoming something else. The house was simple. 3 rooms, a kitchen that opened onto a garden gone wild from neglect, views of the sea from the bedroom window. Nothing like Ashcombe Manor or any of the places either of them had lived when they still had titles and reputations. But it was theirs in a way nothing else had been, purchased with the wages of their various destructions but belonging to people who were trying to learn how to build something, instead of just tear things down. They developed routines slowly, carefully, like people learning to walk after injuries that should have been fatal. Cedric taught languages at a local school for children whose parents worked in fishing or trade. Evelyn found work helping a merchant who imported textiles, using her experience with fabric and trade networks without having to explain where she'd learned those skills. Simple jobs that paid enough to supplement their savings and gave them structure for days that otherwise might have stretched into dangerous emptiness. Evenings they cooked together in the small kitchen, navigating around each other with the awkwardness of people who'd been married for 7 years without ever learning to share space comfortably. The first time Evelyn reached for a knife at the same moment Cedric did, they both froze like they'd been caught in something forbidden. Then Cedric had laughed, a sound so unexpected it startled both of them, and handed her the knife with a small bow, that was half mockery and half genuine courtesy. "You take it," he'd said. "You're better with sharp objects anyway." It should have been a terrible joke. Should have landed like accusation or acknowledgement of all the ways she'd used weapons, both literal and metaphorical. Instead, it felt like permission to acknowledge what they'd been without having to pretend it hadn't happened. They ate dinner that night on the small terrace overlooking the sea, watching fishing boats come in as the sun set. The food was simple, nothing like the elaborate meals they'd eaten during their marriage when every dinner was a performance for guests or family. But it was food they'd made together, in a house they'd chosen together, as people who'd stopped pretending to be anything except exactly what they were: broken, dangerous, trying. Weeks passed, then months. The routines became familiar enough to feel almost comfortable. Evelyn started sleeping through the night without waking in panic, thinking she'd been discovered. Cedric stopped flinching every time someone used the word Duke in conversation, stopped checking over his shoulder like England's authorities might materialize to drag him back to face additional charges. They talked sometimes, late at night when the darkness made honesty easier, about the marriage that had failed, about the choices each of them had made that led to destruction, about whether forgiveness was something they could offer each other or if acceptance was the best they could hope for. "I hated you," Evelyn said one night. They were sitting on the terrace in the dark, drinking cheap wine that tasted like pennies and watching stars emerge over the ocean. "For 7 years I hated you so completely I forgot it wasn't normal to despise your own husband. When I found those letters, I wasn't heartbroken. I was relieved. Finally I had a reason that made sense. A justification for the hatred that had been eating me alive." "I know," Cedric said. "I could feel it. That's why I stayed away." It was easier to mourn Celeste from a distance than face the fact that the woman I'd actually married had started looking at me like I was something that needed to be endured rather than chosen. "Why did you marry me?" Evelyn asked. It was a question she'd never asked during their actual marriage, too afraid of the answer. If you were still in love with Celeste, why propose at all? Cedric took a long drink of wine before answering. "Because that's what dukes did. We married appropriately, to women from acceptable families, and we built dynasties regardless of whether we felt anything except duty. I thought I could do that. Thought I could be married to you and keep my real emotional life locked away in letters to a woman who'd stopped wanting them years ago. I thought I was being adult about it, managing my responsibilities while maintaining connection to something that felt real." "But it wasn't real," Evelyn said. "Celeste told you that. Tried to make you stop." "I know," Cedric said. "But accepting that would have meant accepting I was just alone. That there was no great romance I was being denied by circumstance. Just a regular lonely life I was too cowardly to actually engage with. So I kept writing, kept pretending, and ignored you so thoroughly you had to destroy me to make me finally look at you." The waves below them made sounds like breathing. The night was warm enough that Evelyn could feel sweat at her temples, wine and heat combining to make everything feel slightly unreal. "I'm sorry," she said. The words felt inadequate, but she said them anyway. "For what I did. For how I did it. You didn't deserve to lose everything because I was angry and hurt and wanted you to suffer." Cedric shook his head. "I deserved exactly what happened. Maybe not the method, maybe not the public humiliation, but the core of it. Losing everything because I'd spent 7 years treating my wife like furniture? That was justice. Brutal justice, but justice nonetheless." They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Cedric spoke again. "The question is whether we can be different now, whether knowing what we're capable of doing to each other makes us more careful or just more afraid." "I don't know," Evelyn said honestly. "I'm still angry sometimes, still have moments where I look at you and remember 7 years of feeling invisible. And I think you still have moments where you look at me and remember that I destroyed your entire life deliberately and methodically." "Yes," Cedric said. "All of that is true." "So what do we do with it?" Evelyn asked. Cedric considered this. "I think we keep trying, keep showing up, keep choosing every day to be people who did terrible things to each other, but are committed to not doing them again. It's not romantic. It's not going to produce any grand redemption narrative. But it's honest." Evelyn thought about the woman she'd been in London, the professional destroyer who'd measured her worth in completed assignments and successful manipulations. That woman would have called this weak, would have seen honesty and vulnerability as tactical disadvantages rather than foundations for anything resembling actual connection. But that woman had also been fundamentally empty inside, competent and dangerous, and completely hollowed out by the violence she'd done in service of surviving. Maybe weak was actually strong if it meant being human enough to admit you needed someone else. Maybe vulnerability was courage if it meant accepting that you'd broken yourself, and the only way forward was letting someone else see all the fractured pieces. "I'm gonna fuck this up," she said. "Be cruel or calculating or revert to old patterns. I spent too many years learning to weaponize everything, not to slip sometimes." "So will I," Cedric said. "Be distant or self-involved or assume you're fine when you're not. We're both carrying 7 years of terrible marriage plus everything that happened after. We're going to hurt each other. The question is whether we can hurt each other less than we did before and whether we can repair the damage instead of letting it compound." It wasn't a promise exactly, more like an acknowledgement that they were both disasters trying to build something functional from the wreckage of everything they'd destroyed. Evelyn reached across the space between them and took Cedric's hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and real in a way that felt almost painful after so many months of existing as strategy and calculation rather than flesh and bone. "Okay," she said. "Let's try." The letter from Celeste arrived 3 months later, forwarded through channels that suggested she'd been tracking Evelyn's location, but choosing not to interfere. The envelope was thick cream paper, expensive but understated, containing 2 pages written in Celeste's precise handwriting. Evelyn opened it on the terrace where she and Cedric ate most meals now, watching the sea while the morning was still cool enough to pretend the heat wouldn't be oppressive later. Cedric was inside making coffee. She could hear him moving around the kitchen, humming something off-key that might have been a French folk song or just random notes strung together. She read Celeste's letter twice before Cedric emerged with 2 cups and handed her one without comment. He'd learned not to ask about her silences, just to offer presents and coffee and wait for her to speak when she was ready. "It's from Celeste," Evelyn said finally. "She wants to know if I'm coming back. Says she has assignments lined up that require my specific skill set. Says I'm leaving money on the table by pretending I can be someone I'm not." Cedric sat down across from her. "What are you going to tell her?" Evelyn stared at the letter. Part of her wanted to say yes, wanted to return to Paris and the profession she'd been genuinely good at, the work that had made her feel competent, even if it had also made her feel empty. There was comfort in competence, safety in being the best at something, even if that something was morally complicated. But another part of her remembered sitting on that hotel room floor, feeling something inside her fracture, remembered Cedric's hand closing around hers, and the offer of trying to be human together instead of being successful alone. The work Celeste offered was destruction dressed up as problem-solving. It paid well and used her talents, but it also meant continuing to measure her worth in other people's demolished reputations. Meant remaining the weapon Cedric had accused her of becoming, pointed at targets by people who paid enough to justify the violence. She'd spent 6 months being that weapon, had gotten good at it, had proven she could destroy people for money as easily as she'd destroyed her husband for revenge. The question was whether being good at something meant you should keep doing it regardless of what it cost you internally. "I'm going to tell her no," Evelyn said. The decision settled into her bones as she spoke it aloud, feeling both terrifying and correct in equal measure. "I'm going to tell her I'm done being the person she hired, that I'm trying to be someone else now, and I don't know if I'll succeed, but I have to try." Cedric's expression was complicated. Relief and concern, and something that might have been pride. "You know you're good at that work, better than most people could ever be. Walking away from that is walking away from the thing you might be best at in the world." "I know," Evelyn said, "but being best at destruction isn't actually an achievement worth protecting. It's just proof I survived long enough to weaponize my own damage." "And I'm tired, Cedric. I'm tired of being dangerous. Tired of measuring relationships in terms of utility and threat assessment. Tired of being the person who walks into rooms and immediately calculates how to destroy everyone in it if necessary." She set the letter down and looked at him directly. "I want to be boring. I want to work in a textile shop and cook dinner and sleep through the night without dreaming about strategic destruction. I want to be the kind of person who doesn't terrify herself when she looks in mirrors. And maybe that means wasting whatever talent I have for manipulation and warfare." but I'd rather waste talent than continue becoming someone I can't stand to be. Cedric reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Then tell her no. Tell her you're done. And we'll figure out what boring actually looks like for people like us. Evelyn wrote the response that afternoon. It was shorter than Celeste's letter, just 3 paragraphs that thanked her for the opportunities and the training and explained that Evelyn was choosing a different path. She didn't explain what that path was or justify her decision beyond saying she needed to learn how to build things instead of just destroying them. She sealed it and handed it to Cedric to mail. Letting him handle it felt like a test of her own commitment, trusting someone else with the final severance of the professional identity she'd constructed in Paris. That night they lay in bed listening to the ocean through the open window. The air was thick with salt and the day's accumulated heat. Evelyn could feel sweat between her shoulder blades, could hear Cedric's breathing gradually evening out as he drifted toward sleep. "Are you afraid?" she asked quietly. "That this won't work? That we'll wake up one day and realize we're still just the people who destroyed each other, just with better geography?" Cedric's hand found hers in the darkness. Terrified. "Every single day I'm terrified we're deluding ourselves. That you'll wake up and remember you hate me, or I'll slip back into being the man who ignored you, or we'll both realize that some damage is too fundamental to repair." "But you're still here," Evelyn said. "So are you," Cedric replied. "And maybe that's enough. Maybe showing up when you're terrified is actually braver than pretending you're certain. Maybe commitment isn't the absence of doubt, it's choosing to stay despite the doubt." Evelyn turned toward him in the darkness. She couldn't see his face clearly, but she could feel his presence, solid and real, and equally uncertain about whether they were building something sustainable or just delaying inevitable collapse. She thought about the woman she'd been 8 years ago, young and stupid and believing duty might transform into love. That woman had been disappointed, but she'd also been capable of hope. Capable of imagining futures that weren't just variations of warfare and survival. Somewhere during 7 years of invisibility and 8 months of revenge and 6 months of professional destruction, Evelyn had lost that capacity, had learned to see the world as a battlefield where everyone was either ally or target, and trust was a liability that got you hurt. But lying here in the darkness holding Cedric's hand, she felt something that might have been hope trying to take root again. Fragile and uncertain, and probably doomed, but present, stubborn, refusing to die completely despite everything she'd done to kill it. "I love you," she said. The words felt rusty from disuse, but she forced them out anyway. "I don't know if I know how to anymore. Don't know if what I feel is love or just exhaustion making me vulnerable. But whatever this is, whatever we're trying to build, I want you to know I'm choosing it. Choosing you. Not because I don't have other options, but because you're the only person who knows exactly how broken I am and chooses to stay anyway." Cedric's breath caught. Then his arms came around her, pulling her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her ribs. "I love you too," he said into her hair. "I loved you during our marriage and was too cowardly to do anything about it. Loved you when you destroyed me because I recognized that destroying me was the only power you had in a situation where I'd taken everything else from you. And I love you now, trying to figure out how to be human again. Whatever we build from here, whether it works or fails spectacularly, I need you to know I'm all in. No more fantasies about other women. No more holding back parts of myself. Just this, us. However messy and uncertain and terrifying it gets." They held each other in the darkness while the ocean kept its eternal rhythm beyond the window. Two people who'd been strangers in marriage, enemies in divorce, and were now attempting something harder than either, actually knowing each other without the protective distance of performance or strategy. It felt impossible. It felt necessary. It felt like the only honest thing either of them had done in years. 5 years passed like that. Not smoothly. They fought regularly, old patterns reasserting themselves when stress made them revert to familiar defenses. Evelyn would go cold and calculating when she felt threatened. Cedric would withdraw into himself when he felt criticized. They'd hurt each other in ways both recognized from their marriage and had to actively choose repair instead of escalation. But they learned. Slowly, painfully, with setbacks that sometimes felt catastrophic. They learned to fight without destroying, to hurt each other, and then do the harder work of apologizing and meaning it. To recognize when they were slipping into old roles and call it out before those roles consumed them again. The textile business expanded. Evelyn had a talent for negotiation that didn't require manipulation, just clear assessment of value and fair dealing. She built relationships with suppliers and customers that were based on mutual benefit rather than strategic leverage. It wasn't as immediately satisfying as professional destruction, but it was sustainable in ways that work had never been. Cedric became fluent in Portuguese and started translating documents for the local port authority, work that used his languages without requiring he claim any title or aristocratic background. He was just a man who knew how to move between languages, helping merchants and officials communicate across the barriers of tongue and culture. They were nobody in particular. Two foreigners living quietly in a Portuguese coastal town, occasionally speaking English to each other and keeping mostly to themselves. The locals accepted them with the indifference geography gives to outsiders who don't cause trouble. And somewhere in those 5 years of nobodiness, Evelyn discovered something unexpected. She was content. Not happy exactly. Happiness felt like too big a word for what they'd built. But content. Satisfied in a fundamental way that didn't require constant achievement or victory or proof that she mattered. She mattered to Cedric. He mattered to her. They'd built a life together that was small and unremarkable, and theirs in a way nothing had been when they'd had titles and estates and reputations to maintain. The morning she realized this, she was working in the garden behind their house, hands deep in soil that smelled like salt and growing things. Cedric was inside preparing lunch. She could hear him singing in Portuguese, his accent still terrible after 5 years, but his enthusiasm undimmed. She sat back on her heels and looked at the vegetables she'd planted, at the house they'd made home, at the life they'd constructed from the ruins of everything they'd destroyed. This was enough. More than enough. It was everything she'd been too damaged and dangerous and desperate to recognize she wanted when she'd been busy being visible as a weapon. Cedric emerged from the house with 2 glasses of water and handed her one without comment. He sat down in the dirt beside her, his shoulder touching hers, both of them looking at the garden like it held answers to questions they'd stopped asking years ago. "I'm happy," Evelyn said. The words felt strange in her mouth, foreign and honest and terrifying to admit. "I don't know when it happened, but I am. Happy. Here. With you. With this." Cedric's hand found hers in the dirt. "Me too." His voice was quiet but steady. "I keep waiting for it to feel temporary, like we're just pretending until real life reasserts itself. But this is real life. This garden. This house. Us trying every day to be better than we were. This is the thing we get if we're willing to stop fighting long enough to recognize we already won." "What did we win?" Evelyn asked. "Each other," Cedric said. "Not the versions we were during the marriage. Those people are dead. We won the people we became after destroying each other. The people who know exactly how much damage they're capable of and choose every day not to do it." Evelyn leaned against him, letting his solidity anchor her. 5 years ago, she would have called this weakness, would have seen vulnerability as tactical liability rather than the foundation for actual connection. But she'd learned the difference between being dangerous and being strong, between winning battles and surviving wars. Being dangerous meant having power over others. Being strong meant having power over yourself. She'd mastered the first during those months in Paris working for Celeste, but she was still learning the second, still practicing the harder discipline of choosing repair over destruction when old wounds reopened. They sat in the garden until the sun made it unbearable, then moved inside to eat lunch in the cool dimness of the kitchen. Simple food, simple life, simple love that had required more work and courage than any of the complicated destruction they'd each proven capable of. That evening, a letter arrived. Not from Celeste this time, but from Mrs. Hartwell. The solicitor had tracked Evelyn down through channels that suggested she'd been keeping tabs all along, waiting to see if exile would stick or if Evelyn would slip back into old patterns. The letter was brief and businesslike, containing information rather than judgment. The warrants for Evelyn's arrest had been quietly withdrawn. Political winds had shifted in England. Ashford's disgrace had made him too toxic to be useful as anyone's cause, and the appetite for pursuing a woman who'd fled the country years ago had evaporated. She wasn't pardoned exactly, but she also wasn't actively wanted anymore. If she returned to England under her own name, she'd likely face questioning but not arrest. The information should have felt like freedom. Instead, it just felt like permission to choose whether that freedom mattered. Evelyn showed the letter to Cedric over dinner. He read it twice, then looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite parse. "Do you want to go back?" he asked. Evelyn thought about it honestly. England meant Ashcombe Manor, probably still sitting empty or sold to pay debts. Meant London with its drawing rooms and whisper campaigns. Meant the possibility of reclaiming something approximating her old life if she was willing to fight for it. But it also meant returning to a place where everyone knew her story, where she'd always be the Duchess who lied, the woman who destroyed her husband and then destroyed herself through admitting it, where every interaction would carry the weight of that history. Here in Portugal, she was just Evelyn, a woman who worked in textiles and kept a garden and was learning slowly how to be someone who built things instead of just tearing them down. Nobody knew her history except Cedric. Nobody cared about titles or scandals or the architecture of her various destructions. She looked around the kitchen they'd made home, at the life they'd constructed piece by careful piece over 5 years, at the man across from her who knew exactly how catastrophically they'd both failed at being human and had chosen to try again anyway. "No," she said, "I don't want to go back. This is home now. Not because I'm hiding, but because I actually chose it. Because the person I am here is someone I can stand to be." Cedric's relief was visible. "Good. Because I wasn't sure how to tell you I'd rather stay, even if it meant giving up the possibility of ever reclaiming anything from before." They burned Mrs. Hartwell's letter that night, watched it curl and blacken in the fireplace until nothing remained but ash. A small funeral for the lives they'd left behind. The people they'd been before exile taught them that invisibility could be freedom if you stopped fighting it. 10 years after fleeing London, Evelyn stood on the beach watching sunrise paint the ocean in shades of rose and gold. Her hair was graying now, lines around her eyes from squinting into Portuguese sun. She looked older than her 43 years, but she also looked at peace in a way that had never existed during the decades before. Cedric joined her on the sand, moving slower than he used to, but still steady. They stood shoulder to shoulder, watching light spread across water. Two people who'd learned the hard way that redemption wasn't a destination you reached, but a practice you committed to daily. "Do you ever regret it?" Cedric asked. "Leaving everything behind? Choosing this over the possibility of returning to England, rebuilding some version of your old life?" "Every day," Evelyn said honestly, "and also never. I regret that destruction was necessary, that we had to burn everything down before we could figure out how to build something sustainable. But I don't regret where we ended up. Don't regret choosing us over the architecture of everything we lost." She turned to look at him. His hair was mostly gray now, face weathered by sun and time. He looked nothing like the Duke she'd married 20 years ago, looked instead like someone who'd survived catastrophe and emerged from it humbler and harder and more human than the person who'd entered. "I love you," she said. Not the careful, measured love of people protecting themselves from further damage. Just love. Messy and complicated and real. The kind that survives because both people keep choosing it, even when it's difficult. Cedric's hand found hers. "I love you too, for who you were, who you are, who you're still becoming, for every version of you, including the one who destroyed me. Because that destruction was necessary. It broke both of us open enough that we could actually see each other, instead of just the roles we were performing." They stood on that beach until the sun rose fully, warming sand beneath their feet and salt air around them. Behind them was the small house they'd made home. Ahead of them was ocean stretching to horizons they'd never reach. Between them was the complicated history of two people who'd hurt each other catastrophically and then done the harder work of learning not to. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. They still fought, still hurt each other, still had days where old patterns threatened to consume them, and they had to actively choose repair over destruction. But they showed up, every day, for each other, for the life they'd built from the ruins of everything they'd lost. And somewhere in that showing up, they'd found something neither of them had managed during their original marriage or in the chaotic years after its destruction. They'd found partnership. Actual partnership built on knowing exactly how damaged the other person was and choosing to stay anyway. The sun climbed higher. The day stretched ahead with its routine of work and meals and small kindnesses. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would make headlines or scandals or stories people told about dangerous women and disgraced dukes. Just life. Simple and earned and theirs. Evelyn squeezed Cedric's hand and turned toward home. He walked beside her, their steps matching without conscious effort. Two people who'd spent 20 years learning to move together instead of constantly colliding. The house waited. The garden needed watering. The day's work would begin soon. All of it ordinary. All of it precious. All of it proof that sometimes the greatest victory isn't winning the war, but surviving long enough to realize you were fighting the wrong battle all along. The real battle had never been about being seen or being powerful or being dangerous enough to never be hurt again. The real battle was about being human in a world that rewarded performance over authenticity, about choosing vulnerability when armor felt safer, about building when destruction came easier. They'd lost that battle for most of their lives, spent decades performing for invisible audiences, protecting themselves with walls that became indistinguishable from prisons. But they were winning it now, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks and struggles and the constant work of choosing each other over their own worst instincts. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Maybe the whole point of surviving catastrophe was learning that you didn't need to be invincible to be whole. You just needed to be honest, to keep showing up, to love someone else as messily and imperfectly as they loved you. The door closed behind them. The house embraced them with familiar shadows and the smell of yesterday's bread. Through the window, the ocean continued its eternal rhythm, caring nothing for human drama or the small redemptions people built from their own wreckage. Evelyn and Cedric moved through morning routines they'd performed 1,000 times, making coffee, planning the day's work, existing together in the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed constant conversation to confirm they still mattered to each other. This was the ending they'd earned, not grand or tragic or suitable for ballads, just real. Two people who destroyed each other learning to build something that might actually last. Two ghosts who'd haunted themselves for years finally becoming solid enough to cast shadows in sunlight. The story that began with letters hidden beneath floorboards ended here, in a small house overlooking Portuguese coast, with two people who'd traveled from London to Paris to Calais to Lisbon, learning finally that home wasn't a place or a title or a reputation. Home was choosing every day to be the kind of person who could look in mirrors without flinching. Home was this, them, now, imperfect and earned and real. And for two people who'd spent most of their lives being anything except real, that was victory enough. The sun climbed toward noon. The day continued. Life went on, and somewhere in its continuation, Evelyn Ashcombe smiled.